Hello everyone, if you're new to my channel, consider liking and subscribing. It will make me feel wonderful if you do that. Thanks. By the way, I also have another Naruto and Luffy fanfiction channel. If you are interested, link is in the description.
Straw Hat Luffy, The Black Fist by J.R.R. Toast. What if Luffy had never eaten the devil fruit Shanks had brought into the bar that day? What if he started sailing a little earlier than canon? How would his story be different? Would he be the same Luffy we know and love? One thing is for sure, Luffy and his friends are in for a wild adventure. Adios.
Chapter 24. Time Flies, Part 2. Hey, Luffy. Usopp said as he sat on a bench beside the slightly younger teen. Zoro had gone to find booze somewhere in town and the two were waiting for him to get back, which they both knew could take a while. "Where's Levi gonna go when we head to the Grand Line?" he curiously asked. The long-nosed boy didn't even really know how getting into the Grand Line worked. He'd heard that you had to enter through a place called Reverse Mountain, but he had no idea what that entailed. Or where it was for that matter. "What do you mean? He's coming with us," replied Luffy, incredulously, his hat covering his face. He wasn't just gonna leave his friend all by his lonesome there in the East Blue. That might be kind of hard. I'm pretty sure the current on Reverse Mountain would rip your friend Levi to pieces. "What the heck? No way. Levi's way strong, he can take some currents just fine." The teen pouted through his hat. "I'm sure he's very strong, however, the currents on Reverse Mountain are, very likely, stronger." "No," huffed Luffy, childishly. "Alright then, how about this? If you're expecting him to pull you between islands, he won't be able to. Sea creatures from the Blues don't do well on the Grand Line. They lack the necessary traits that would enable them to navigate its waters." The black-haired boy continued to pout. "Well, I don't care. Levi is coming with me. We're buddies. I can't just leave him." Sun hit his eyes, unexpectedly, as his hat was lifted from his face. "What the heck, Usopp? Gimme back my hat," he demanded, squinting to look at his friend. When his vision cleared, his eyes were met by the image of Usopp with two hands growing out of his shoulders and covering his mouth. Two more hands, growing out of his stomach, were holding his arms in place, and yet another set kept his feet firmly rooted to the ground. Luffy's eyes turned to stars. "Whoa, Usopp, I didn't know you had more than two hands. Where the heck have you been hiding those?" A laugh from behind made him turn, his eyes meeting a beautiful black-haired woman. The woman was tall and slender but curvy in, what most would say, all the right places. She had straight shoulder-length black hair that was cut into bangs at the front and tan skin covering her from head to toe. Her eyes were a deep blue, the thin iris wrapping around a large black pupil, and Luffy thought they were beautiful to look at. On her head, she wore a white cowboy hat that matched a long but thin white fur coat hanging on her shoulders. Underneath, she wore a long-sleeved purple shirt with a modest collar and a matching short skirt. The long tan legs under the skirt led down to more purple in the form of a pair of heels. Jewelry-wise, the boy didn't see much, other than a golden band on her arm that had the black letters, BW, stamped into it. "Like what you see?" she asked with a teasing smile, uncrossing the hands in front of her chest and dropping them back down to her sides. Usopp's screaming immediately burst into the air as the hands growing from his body dissolved into flower petals. He stood up and immediately began to run for his life. That had been one of the scariest experiences of his life. 1 second he'd been about to reply and the next, arms were growing out of his body where they weren't supposed to. He may be a big bounty hunter now, but that kind of stuff wasn't normal and it was scary. The woman giggled at the reaction and waited for the black-haired boy to say something, spinning his straw hat on her finger. "I'd appreciate it if you gave me my hat back," insisted Luffy, seriously. He didn't know who this person was and he didn't like it when strangers touched his treasure. Even if she did have a really cool power. She smiled, apologetically, and obliged, tossing the hat back in his direction. "I'm sorry if I offended you. I really was just trying to get your attention." The teen caught his hat and immediately put it back on his head, sighing in relief. With his treasure recovered, he looked up at the lady and pointed at her face. "You have really pretty eyes," he complimented. "Why thank you, Straw Hat Luffy. No one told me you were such a charmer," the black-haired woman replied, teasingly. She gestured to the seat next to the boy, asking if she could sit. Luffy nodded his head in confirmation. "How do you know my name?" he asked curiously as she sat on the bench next to him, crossing her legs. Did she really need to sit that close? He shook his head at the thought. It's not like he really minded, she was really pretty. Like Nami pretty, and that was saying something. "I'd be surprised if there was someone in the East Blue that didn't know your name. Or at least the name of Mary's terrible trio," she answered, eyeing the straw-hatted teen critically. "You guys have been big for a couple of months now. I'm actually surprised there are still pirates left in this ocean at all. The three of you have been working hard." Luffy thought about her answer for a moment. It was true, they were pretty well known as bounty hunters now. They'd been doing it for a good long while and each of them had grown in their own ways. He brought his hand up to look at it before dropping it back down with a sigh. He still couldn't use haky. It was starting to make him nervous, as he wasn't completely sure it was going to come back. He shook his head, looking back up a pair of pretty blue eyes. He could think about that later. "Yeah." The boy laughed. They really had been working hard. Well, these days it was mostly Usopp. Most of the people they fought weren't very strong, so they were good practice for his long-nosed friend. He'd grown a lot in the past months and Luffy was happy to see it. He was really glad Usopp had come with them. Trips were more fun when there were more people. The only ones left are the bigger ones, and Zoro wanted to leave those for last. Luffy explained. The woman nodded her head in understanding. Luffy looked at her expectantly, waiting for her to get to the point of why she was there. "So, did you want something with me or?" "I'll be frank with you, Luffy. My boss." She paused for a second, looking him in the eyes. "He wants to hire you." It took the teen some time to understand her words, and he still wasn't sure he did. "For what?" he asked, confused. The black-haired woman seemed to think for a moment before answering. "He wants to hire you as a bounty hunter." She eventually said, "He wants you to be one of the top brass in his organization." Luffy took in the words and thought about them. He didn't think he'd like working for someone. Plus, the bounty hunting thing was only temporary. So, he didn't really even need to think about it. The answer was easy. "No thanks," he replied with a big smile. His eyes stayed on the woman as he waited for another question. "Is that it?" he asked, curiously. She looked at the boy for a long moment before standing up and giving him a smile in return. "Yes. That was all I wanted to ask you. It's a shame, but I understand. I will let my boss know of your answer." She sent Luffy a teasing smile, winking in his direction. "I think we could have had a lot of fun working together." The word fun brought Luffy back to the hands growing out of Usopp earlier. He wanted to see them again. He thought it was way cool. "Hey, can you show me your power again? I really liked it," he asked with enthusiasm. The pretty lady laughed an angelic laugh and she sent the boy a smile, sitting back down. It wasn't often someone wanted to see her devil fruit power. She crossed her hands in front of her body, fore. Luffy jumped in surprise when he felt two hands grow out of the sides of his stomach, laughing loudly when they began to tickle him. "Stop it, lady, that tickles," he cried through his laughter. His laughs died down when her hands stopped in their assault of his sides and he curiously looked up at the brim of his hat. It felt heavier for some reason. He took off his treasure and gaped when he saw fingers grow in yellow straw. His eyes turned to stars when he looked back at the lady. She was so cool. The woman laughed at the look Luffy was sending her. She'd never seen someone's eyes turn into stars before. "You're a very interesting boy, Straw Hat Luffy." She smiled at him. "I think I've decided I like you." "Well, I like you too, lady," he replied with his signature smile. "I really like your power. I bet it's really handy." His mind began to wander and he couldn't help but think about how much food he could stuff into his mouth if he had more hands. It actually made him kind of jealous. "It certainly can be." She laughed. She was enjoying talking with the straw-hatted boy. She hadn't been so candid with someone in quite some time. Her eyes roamed his form and found the necklace hanging around his neck. It was beautiful and she couldn't help but want to know where he'd gotten it. "That's quite the necklace you have there," she said, pointing at the brown cord. Luffy looked down to where she was pointing and smiled. "Yeah, I really like it, it's one of my treasures." He looked up at the woman's eyes and pointed to his hat, just like this. "May I ask where you got it?" the black-haired woman asked. She really was just curious. It was interesting that he considered his hat a treasure, but she was more intrigued by the necklace, so she didn't voice her interest in that particular item. The teen smiled at the question. "Someone I really look up to, and one of his friends. Helped me make it a long time ago." The answer satisfied her and she nodded, continuing to smile in Luffy's direction. It was strange, but the jewels connected to the leather cord reminded her of devil fruits. She made to continue her line of questioning but then realized how much time she'd spent chatting and decided not to. It was time for her to get moving. Her boss would be waiting to hear from her. "Well, it is very beautiful," she said, beginning to stand to her feet. "I very much enjoyed our conversation, Straw Hat Luffy, but I'm afraid that it's time for me to take my leave." Luffy pouted at the words but didn't make to stop her. He'd really liked talking with the pretty lady and was sad to see her go. The unnamed woman turned away from the bench, looking over her shoulder with a smile. "I'm very glad to have met you and I hope it's not the last time we get to chat." She turned her head away and made to walk into the crowd. However, before she could take her first step, Luffy's voice sounded from behind. "Hey, pretty lady," he said, making her turn back in his direction. "What's your name?" Said pretty lady seemed to think for a moment before replying, staring at the straw-hatted teen with her mesmerizing blue eyes. A small smile came to her lips as she shook her head to herself, turning away from Luffy and toward the crowd once again. She shot a teasing look at the teen from over her shoulder. "You can call me Miss All Sunday." Without another word, the straw-hatted boy watched the woman seemingly melt from his sight and into the crowd. She'd been interesting and he hoped he got to meet her again someday. Her power was so cool, plus, he'd really enjoyed talking with her. "Miss All Sunday," Luffy repeated into the air, groaning. He totally wasn't gonna remember that, it was too long. He wished it had been shorter. He shrugged his shoulders, pushing his hat down to cover his face. If he forgot, he'd just have to ask the pretty lady again. If he ever saw her. Thoughts on the matter settled. The straw-hatted teen closed his eyes. He was still waiting on Zoro and he guessed Usopp now, too. It seemed like the perfect opportunity for a nap. So, that's precisely what he did. It only took a mere few seconds for the boy to fall into the dark realm of Morpheus, and for once, he didn't dream solely of meat. Instead, his usual fantasy was accompanied by a woman with beautiful blue eyes using her amazing power to shove his face full of food. A teardrop fell and stained the gray newspaper in the girl's hands, her eyes scanning the paper again. "Mary's Terrible Trio. Good, or evil?" was the headline stamped across the top of the page. Brown eyes drank in the picture of her three friends underneath the words. She missed them. Even Usopp. The time they all spent together felt like a lifetime ago. Nami stuffed the paper into her shirt and erased the thoughts, looking at the approaching pirates from the deck of the large merchant ship she'd snuck onto. She was almost there again. She was almost back to 100 million. Her eyes thinned into a glare. This time she would make sure the money got to Arlong's hands before he could do anything about it. And if she ever saw Nezumi again. Let's just say it would be hard for her to not try and murder the man. "Get back here, straw hat brat. No one insults my boot." A voice screamed over the pounding of footsteps of an angry mob of pirates. Luffy's only response was laughter, dodging his way through the forest and trying to stay ahead of the men that wanted to kill him. They were pretty slow, so it wasn't too hard. His feet carried him into a clearing and he crossed it as quickly as he could, a voice shooting into the air. "Usopp, you're up," yelled Zoro from his place sitting on a tree branch. The long-nosed boy nodded at his future crewmate and steadied his hand, pulling back his slingshot. The three bounty hunters were currently pursuing a bounty on not just a single pirate, but a bounty on a whole crew. Frankly, it had been sheer dumb luck that they'd found the pirates all in one place, but none of the temporary bounty hunters were complaining. It beat trying to search for them. Usopp continued to pull his slingshot further back. A small addition had been made to the weapon in the form of a wrist brace, enabling him to draw even further and increase his firepower by a good margin. He'd have to thank Saul if they ever made it back to East Lodestone. He stopped pulling when he felt he'd reached maximum draw length, eyes peeled on the tree line. The sniper had gotten to know his slingshot a lot better over the last couple of months and was now capable of things he never thought he could do before he became a bounty hunter. The pirates stampeded into the clearing and Usopp kept his hand steady, waiting for his moment. He eyed the raging group from his tree branch and searched for the right spot, eyes widening when he found it. He immediately let his projectiles fly. Lead star. His green slingshot snapped forward, multiple lead bullets releasing from its pouch. and the projectiles moved through the air so fast that no one in the yelling crowd even noticed them until it was too late. Usopp watched the volley move through the air and reloaded his slingshot in the blink of an eye, searching for something. His eyes widened when they found what they were looking for, and he drew back as hard as he could before quickly releasing. Scattershot. A singular metal ball shot forward and somehow flew faster than the ones fired previously, sailing in between them just before they would have impacted against the stampeding pirates. The small projectile reached the middle of the grouping and finally connected with another, creating a chain reaction. The pieces of metal began to knock into each other in the air and rebound into the pirates with even more force than they were originally released with. Lead ripped through the group of men, their yells of pain sounding around the clearing. A bloody mist erupted into the air surrounding them, some of the pirates dropping to the ground, dead, and others moaning in agony, holding bleeding wounds. Of the more than 20 men that rushed into the clearing, there was only one who remained standing. The captain of the bootleg pirates stood frozen in place as he watched the crimson mist settle on the ground and paint his men red. His eyes were wide. What the hell was going on? He'd heard rumors and seen a few articles in the news about Mary's terrible trio, but that was all he thought they were, rumors. Even if they had some truth, at most, the articles had been exaggerating. What kind of bounty hunting group could destroy an entire town in pursuit of a bounty? It didn't sound real. He and his boys had just been having a nice drink when the straw-hatted kid had waltzed in and made fun of his boot. It had made him mad. So mad, in fact, that he had the crew try and kill the kid. But they hadn't been able to catch him, and he eventually led them into the forest. His wide eyes gazed across the moaning men on the ground spread amongst various dead bodies, and he dropped to his knees in surrender. Just who the hell were these kids? Please come see us again, sometime, Sanji's smooth voice said, suavely. The woman blushed, smiling back at the teen who grabbed her hand and laid a soft kiss on her knuckle. The blonde looked up at the beautiful blushing face belonging to the one whose hand he held. You bless this place with your bee. That's my fiancé, you creep. The man opposite the woman yelled in rage, his chair screeching across the floor and interrupting the black-suited chef. He moved behind the teen before he could so much as twitch and threw a punch as hard as he could at the back of his head. Sanji's eyes never left the beautiful woman's, his head seeming to move on its own as it tilted out of the way. The man's fist hit open air and he stumbled forward, the chef spinning to the right and standing at the same time. He watched from behind as the man fell toward the table and grabbed the back of his jacket to stop the fall. There's still food left on that table and I won't let you waste it, he said, a very serious tone to his voice, roughly pulling backward on the man's coat, his back slamming into the ground with a smack. The woman gasped as her fiancé's groans sounded into the air. I'll have your job for this, he wheezed, rolling on the floor and trying to regain his breath. Sanji looked down at the man and scowled. He went to reply but was interrupted when he heard the front entrance open. He turned toward the sound and his eyes immediately turned into hearts when he saw someone familiar standing there. He sent one more wink at the woman still sitting wide-eyed at the table before he twirled toward the front to greet the person who had just entered the restaurant. Lady Karina. I'm so glad you came to see me. Zoro held his katanas above one another and parallel to the ground, the tips pointing to the right. Nightoryu. He burst forward toward his adversary and slashed across where the boy's stomach should have been, two-cutter. Luffy was already out of the way of the blade, flipping over the verde and landing behind him. His fist flew forward without hesitation and found the back of Zoro's skull. Or at least it should have. A boom sounded through the air, the fist rocketing over the swordsman's head and ruffling his hair as he moved just in time to not get knocked out. He turned on a dime and brought Kitetsu and Kaguya upward with all of his strength, tower climb. The straw-hatted teen jumped backward and two purple slashes sailed upward into the empty space, right through the area he'd previously occupied. Pistol, he screamed, shooting his hand through the air. Zoro sliced one of his blades through the projectile and ducked when he heard a second scream of pistol. The second air bullet raced above him and he stood, wasting as little time as possible, bringing his blades down in the direction of his future captain. Tower climb return. Two more purple slashes left his blade at even greater speeds and he scowled when he saw those miss as well. Luffy was just too damn fast. He brought his katanas parallel to the ground once again, the tips facing the left side this time, and ripped them through the air. Flash. Before the projectiles even left his blades, Kitetsu and Kaguya were already moving into position for his next move, holding them diagonally against his body. Ripple. The straw-hatted boy's eyes widened slightly at the 4 air blades moving toward him. His friend's attacks were getting faster. He bent his body to dodge the first set of slashes, managing to escape them unharmed, but the second pair was too close to completely avoid. Luffy's foot dug into the ground and he launched to the right, just as one of the slashes sliced into his arm, hissing in pain. He landed with his eyes searching for his opponent, looking up in shock as Zoro's form fell from the sky. He hadn't even seen him jump. His foot cracked the earth and sent his body back in the direction he came from, Zoro screaming, "Demon Bear," as his blades connected with the ground. The earth rumbled and the immediate area surrounding Zoro ruptured, purple flashing upward from newly created fissures. The black-haired boy managed to move in time but just barely, his feet carrying him away from his opponent while the purple light ripped through the middle of the area, creating havoc around the swordsman. Luffy couldn't help his widening smile. He was having way too much fun. He bolted back in his friend's direction and slammed his hand into the dirt with all the strength in his upper body. "Sun Palm!" he roared, cracks rocketing through the earth in a circular wave around him. Zoro flipped through the air and landed just outside the blast radius, slashing Kitetsu through the air and following behind the air blade while it traveled toward his opponent. "Nightoryu!" he growled. The swordsman let his arms drag behind him before halting his momentum and heaving his katanas through the air. Divider, in the blink of an eye, he'd already flipped Kitetsu in his hand and coiled his body, his form blurring as he spun through the air. Luffy watched in wonder when the first light purple slash seemed to give birth to 2 darker ones on either side of it. His feet cracked into the earth and he bounded toward the projectiles with a big smile. He jumped forward just before all the air blades would have met in the middle and dove through a gap so small it looked like he shouldn't have been able to fit. "Equinox!" Zoro screamed, finishing his rotation. Grinding sounded into the air from behind when Luffy's body came through the other side and his eyes widened, his vision held by a quickly growing violet rain. "Not good." Thinking quickly, the straw-hatted teen rotated his body in the air and punched toward the sky. "Pistol!" The force of the strike sent his back crashing into the ground, cracking it as the purple rain flew over his face. In a flash, he was back on his feet, and it only took one large step to get inside the guard of the swordsman he was fighting, Sun Palm. He curled the knuckles on his right hand and shot his arm forward with blinding speed. Zoro's eyes widened when he felt his future captain step inside his guard, looking down just in time to move his enhancement to the middle of his chest, right over his heart. "Impact!" Luffy yelled, a huge grin consuming his face. The palm connected with the Zoro's chest and he immediately felt his enhancement crack. That wasn't good. His eyes widened as what felt like a circular wave of pain spread throughout his whole body, feet leaving the ground. His form shot in the opposite direction, flying through the air for a moment, before he curled his body and roughly landed, rolling to avoid any extra damage. The swordsman shakily stood to his feet, groaning. That had hurt. Even though his enhancement, it was a good thing he'd figured out how to move it around. He was aching all over, like the attack had somehow affected his entire body. The fact that Luffy could do that much damage without haky was honestly frightening. Zoro took a deep breath and drew his third katana, placing Wado Ichimonji in his mouth. He'd warmed up enough. "Are they always like this?" Gaiman asked, looking over at Usopp as the two and the rest of the island's inhabitants watched Luffy and Zoro spar. Usopp went to respond but paused before any words left his mouth. They didn't spar very much, actually, when he thought about it. No, not really. The long-nosed boy eventually let them fight each other once or twice. It was definitely something, though. Every time he got to watch them, he was amazed. The two moved so fast he almost couldn't keep up. They were also just insanely strong. He'd grown a lot in the months they'd been bounty hunting, but he was still nowhere near those two. Purple suddenly consumed Usopp's vision and his eyes widened, diving to tackle Gaiman to the ground. The air blade passed over the heads of all the spectators and into the forest behind, the sound of trees falling echoing from the same direction. The long-nosed teen lifted his head and looked at the two still battling with outrage on his face. "Watch where you shoot those things. Zoro." He screamed in anger before looking down at the bushy green-haired man stuck in a treasure chest. "You alright, Gaiman?" Now that he was thinking about it, the man was rather short. He probably hadn't needed to tackle him. Gaiman only laughed in response. He was having a jolly old time. This was the most excitement he'd felt in a very long time. "Oh, you don't need to worry about me, Sonny. I'm doing fine," he replied, eagerly continuing to watch the two friends fight one another. "Pistol!" Luffy screamed, his arm cracking through the air. The largest air bullet yet materialized, and he followed in behind the projectile just like Zoro had earlier with the flying slash, but much closer, his eyes firmly locked on his opponent. Zoro slashed Kaguya through the air and cut the bullet in half, sending the halves past his head. Kitetsu came in after, to hit the body running behind the projectile, but was met with empty air, the swordsman's vision locking on Luffy's form as he flipped over him. He felt a pair of hands grab the back of his shirt and his eyes widened. Luffy grasped the cloth shirt with all his strength and pulled Zoro over his head, slamming him into the ground with a grunt of exertion. His arm came back to knock his opponent out and end the fight, but when he shot it forward, the swordsman moved just enough for it to crack the ground instead of his nose. A katana suddenly appeared at his neck and he bent backward just quickly enough to watch the sword pass over his face, jumping away when another came at his middle. Zoro bent down and started his enhancement once more, Watto already beginning to drink up the haky flowing through him. His swords pointed to the sky as he crossed his arms in front of his body. Santoryu. The ground splintered underneath the swordsman's feet, his form blasting toward his adversary. Luffy watched his friend approach in absolute glee, smirking to himself. He pulled his arm back and loaded as much power as he could into it. If he got the timing on this wrong, he could probably die. Just before the Verde heaved his swords forward with a shout of shimmering demon cut, Luffy's coiled arm rocketed out, toward the ground, pistol. The sheen of three blades split the now glittering air and Zoro gaped, watching all of his katanas miss the figure now sailing higher and higher above him. His future captain turned his body toward the ground and he didn't like the smile being sent in his direction. He barely had enough time to get his swords up before Luffy's arms began to blur through the air with a shout of Gatling. The projectiles rocketed into everything in the general vicinity of Zoro, dust clouding his vision as he tried to block and slice as many of the bullets as he could. The swordsman grunted in effort and pain at the same time. There were just too many for him to handle, and even though they were just air, they hurt. Luffy's roaring stopped and a gust of wind blew the dust away so he could be seen clearly again. Sun Palm. The straw-hatted boy screamed in joy, looking down as his body began to fall. The wind started to blow by his face while he accelerated in the direction of his opponent, his smile stretching to absurd proportions at watching his opponent's form quickly grow larger. Zoro watched the scene with wide eyes. Was he really going to use that move? It could kill him. His eyes widened even further when he heard the word, meteor, yelled into the air. His eyelids drifted shut and he awaited the pain he knew was coming. The only thing he was really able to do was pray he didn't die. It was already too late for him to move. The sound of someone landing heavily on the ground and a slap to his right cheek made the swordsman open his eyes, just as his future captain began to laugh. "I can't do that one without haky," Luffy admitted honestly. He had a strong feeling that his hand would shatter if he tried. Not to mention the rest of his body. Zoro groaned slightly. His body still hurt from the sun palm attack, and the air bullets hadn't helped. He pushed the pain to the back of his mind and looked at the other boy's hand intently. "Still not back?" he asked, eyes coming back up. "Nope," replied Luffy, popping the pea and turning toward the spectators. The fact didn't bother him too much, it would come back when it was time. And, if it didn't, oh well. It wouldn't stop him from becoming the Pirate King. He would just keep getting stronger without it like he already had been. The teen's eyes landed on Gaiman and his thoughts were pulled in a completely different direction as he began to sprint toward the tiny man. A huge smile on his face. "Small guy. Let me try to squeeze in there with you." Chapter 25. Romance Dawn. Makino stood next to the mayor of the village with a large smile on her face as they both watched the lamb-headed ship sail out to sea. "So, he's finally doing it. I'll miss that little rascal." She looked over at the short man beside her and sent him a smirk, just like his brother. "Am I right, Mr. Mayor?" "Don't even get me started on Ace, Makino," the man replied grouchily, watching the vessel disappear in the distance. "If he becomes even half the pirate his brother is," he turned his back to the sea, beginning to walk back toward town, "he'll bring even more shame to this village." The green-haired woman watched the mayor leave in amusement, before turning back to the sea and smiling. "Be safe, Luffy," she whispered to no one in particular. Once the words left her mouth, she held her gaze until the vessel faded from her sight before turning away and following the mayor back into town with a soft smile on her face. Luffy stood on the figurehead of the Going Merry with a massive smile, a loop of rope resting firmly in his hands as Levi pulled him on his first ever voyage as a pirate. The now 17-year-old boy had changed much since he and Levi had set out on that day almost a year ago. He stood at a height of 5'8" and it looked like he would continue to grow in the future. He'd shed some of the youngness in his face and his body had filled out a bit more, making him seem a little older than he had back then. The muscles showing on his figure had also grown as well and were slightly bigger, looking a little more defined. The lankiness of his form had all but disappeared and he really just looked lean and built, now. He probably even looked a little older than his actual age. His outfit was almost the exact same, the only changes to it being the pants and a small adjustment to his red vest. Instead of the usual shorts, he now wore a pair of loose-fitting jeans that cut off just below the middle of his shin bone. Around the bottoms of the jeans, the fabric was frayed, making it look white and fluffy. The change to his vest was in the form of a high collar wrapping around his neck instead of the fabric laying flat like it used to. Everything else was the same as he usually had it. In regards to strength, Luffy had grown by leaps and bounds. His punches were literally as strong as pistols, now. Plus, he'd learned how to find cores a little better. He still didn't think he'd even really scratched the surface of what he could do with his sun palm, but he could at least use it consistently now. The one thing that wasn't so great was the fact that he still couldn't use armament haky. The battle against Forest Guy had been forever ago and it was still gone. A part of him was already reserved to the fact that he might have been cut off from the power permanently. The other part was still hoping that it would just suddenly come back at some point. He'd been wondering if the exhaustion affected his conqueror's haky, so, after he'd made it back to Dawn, he'd had a couple of days to himself and found a secluded place to answer that question. And it didn't. Thankfully. It would have been a real bummer if he hadn't been able to use that either. "Levi, what the heck is that?" Luffy yelled, his eyes glued to a spot just off the starboard side of the ship. His answer was a deep rumbling from the water below. "A whirlpool? I've never seen one before," he said in wonder, watching the swirling water intently as they passed it. If he wasn't the only one on the ship, he totally would have tried to swim in it. It looked like it would be tons of fun. The pirate captain pouted while he watched the swirling water get further and further away, turning to face the sea once again. As he looked out at the blue water glittering in the sun, the pout on his face disappeared and was replaced with a massive smile. He was finally a pirate. The thought made Luffy absolutely giddy inside. It also reminded him of something. "Levi, stop for a second. I gotta do something real quick," he yelled down to the water below. The taut rope in his hands slackened and he hung it around the neck of Mary's figurehead, turning and rushing down to the main deck, the boat continuing to slowly drift forward from its remaining momentum. The straw-hatted teen's eyes found the cloth bag Makino had given him and he rushed to pick it up, opening it as soon as it was in his hands. He reached in and grabbed what he was looking for, pulling it out with an excited bout of laughter. Black fabric spread from the opening of the bag in the form of a flag. On the black flag was the image of an artistic smiling skull wearing a straw hat, the same hat currently on Luffy's head. Crossbones sat behind the skull, creating an X in the background of the picture and turning the flag into what it really was, a pirate flag. And, not just any pirate flag. No. It was the flag of Straw Hat Luffy. The flag of the Straw Hat Pirates. Luffy quickly turned and ran straight at the mast, firmly grasping the fabric in his hands. He wasted no time in scaling the large wooden pole, hastily making his way toward the crow's nest. He would have jumped, but he didn't want to hurt the Mary. His hands grasped the edge of the circular rail and hoisted him over it, never letting go of the black flag. The black-haired teen walked over to the tip of the mast and began tying the flag onto the wood. Once finished, he let the fabric out of his grasp and took a small step back, admiring the black cloth now waving in the wind. Satisfied, Luffy hopped back over the railing and slid down the mast. He turned to go back to the figurehead and continue sailing but noticed that the bag Makino had given him didn't look empty. He walked over, picking it back up, and reached into it curiously. His hand came out with another smaller black cloth and a piece of paper. He let the fabric unfold itself before opening the piece of paper and was surprised to see a smaller version of his flag. What would he need this for? The boy shrugged and opened the piece of paper, recognizing Makino's handwriting. "Don't forget about the mizzenmast. Be safe out there, you'll always be missed here on Dawn, but I know I'll be seeing you in the newspaper again, soon enough. Also, open up the mainsail when you get the chance. I left you a little surprise. Makino, P.S. If you see your brother out there, tell him I said hello." Luffy folded the note back up with a smile, slipping the paper into his pants pocket and turning his attention back to the flag in his hands. He wanted to put it up, but there was a small problem. He had no idea what a mizzenmast was. His eyes glanced around the ship looking for an answer, and it came quicker than he thought it would. His gaze found the mast at the back of the boat and his problem was solved. Mizzenmast had the word mast in it, so that had to be what she was talking about. The straw-hatted teen rushed the mast now in his sights, and scaled this one even quicker than the last. There was nowhere to stand when he made it to the top, so he wrapped his legs around the skinny pole and held himself there as he tied the flag at the same time. When his job was completed, he lightly loosened his legs and fell back to the deck below, turning to walk to the figurehead again. However, he remembered one last thing from Makino's note and stopped. The mainsail. Luffy made his way back up the large wooden pole and into the crow's nest, his feet stepping back over the railing, onto the boom. He walked to the end of the horizontal piece of wood and carefully undid the rope keeping the sail rolled up. When he felt the rope slacken and the fabric start to unroll, he quickly stood and rushed his way to the opposite side, repeating the same process. The sound of the mainsail tightening from the wind hit the pirate captain's ears and he rushed to get back to the crow's nest, once again sliding down the main mast. As soon as he felt solid wood under his feet, he blasted off up to the front deck, wanting to see what Makino's surprise was. He has making him giddy. The boy's sandals found Mary's figurehead and he slowly turned to face the now unfurled mainsail, anticipation all over his face. When his eyes met the fabric, he couldn't help the largening of his smile. Makino really was the best. The mainsail was almost completely covered in another perfect rendition of his Jolly Roger. Luffy continued to smile at the picture for a moment before turning away and toward the sea behind him. "All right, Levi. Time to go get Zoro. I left him in shell." Cannon fire echoed in the distance and the boy paused in his speech, squinting as he looked in the direction of the sun. He saw something. Was it another ship? "Hey, Levi, I want to go see what's up over there," he said, grabbing his end of the loop of rope from the figurehead's neck. The rope was pulled taut and the ship began to move quicker than she had been moments earlier, Luffy grasping the rope tightly as he strained to keep himself anchored to the Mary. Honestly, one of the reasons he'd probably put on some muscle was because he had to do this all the time. It was hard. The two companions covered the distance to their destination quickly and arrived to the sound of more cannon fire. Now that he was closer, Luffy could see that one of the ships was flying a pirate flag. The flag had a skull and crossbones with the skull facing the left side of the flag. In the center of the skull's head was a big red heart. The straw-hatted teen whistled to Levi as he examined the rest of the pirate ship, the Mary slowing on his command. A light pink color that wasn't very appealing to the eye covered the entirety of the vessel. It was bigger than the Mary by a good margin with 3 masts that all had white sails with red hearts in the center of them. All in all, he thought it was a really ugly way to travel. The teen's head turned and he looked at the craft currently being fired at. It was huge, way bigger than both the Mary and the pirate ship. Most of the boat was colored white and windows lined almost every inch of it. He began to turn his head back to the ugly ship, but something caught his eye. A small boat, connected to the large white vessel via a short rope, sat rocking in the water. He searched for any occupants but found none. The Luffy shrugged to himself before turning to the pink ship and stilling for a moment while he decided what to do, cannonballs splashing against the water in the background. "Hey, Levi," the boy eventually yelled. "I think I'm gonna go beat those guys up," he said, pointing in the direction of the pink ship as his friend rose out of the water to look at him. "You think you can take care of the Mary for a little bit? I promise I won't be long." He hadn't had a good fight in a while and this seemed like the perfect opportunity. At the nod of the sea monster, Luffy dove head first into the water. "Thanks, buddy," he exclaimed, beginning to swim in the direction he'd indicated. It still wasn't close enough to the other ship for boarding, but it was getting there. It wouldn't be long before all hell broke loose and he wanted to be there when it happened. He slowed his form, nearing the boat, and grasped the pink wood to climb up. It was hard to find handholds, but he managed and eventually pulled himself over the edge of the railing. Luffy looked around the deck as scrambling men tried to prepare to board the larger ship, cannon fire still sounding in the background. Not a single one of them had even noticed that he was on the ship. He shrugged to himself and began to casually walk the wooden planks under his feet. Pirates rushed by him as the bigger ship continued to get closer and, still, no one said a word. Maybe they were just idiots? A door on his left caught Luffy's eye and the boy didn't hesitate to pull it open, walking straight through. He stepped into a long empty hallway with doors on either side, standing still for a moment, before he pushed onward, eventually stopping in front of the last door on the right. The reason he stopped was simple. It smelled like there was food the door and it made him hungry. Now he wanted something to eat, and, with that thought in mind, he pulled the door open and stepped through. As soon as he crossed the threshold, however, a scream pierced through the air. Nami stripped off her dress and tucked it into her backpack, turning to walk out of the bathroom door. The Orangeite had gone to change at just the right time, right before the pirates boarded. Now, they would all be over there and not guarding their ship. Their treasure would be ripe for the taking. Her feet carried her out of the bathroom and through the halls of the cruise liner, finding the end of the hallway. She waited with her ear against the door, until she could hear the sounds of commotion outside, before pushing it open. Screams ripped through the air as chaos spread around the deck of the ship, but Nami ignored it, pushing her legs as hard as she could. She grabbed the knife from her short skirt and got ready to use it to help her get to the pirate ship. She stepped up to the railing and placed her knife over one of the boarding ropes now connecting the two ships. Taking a deep breath, she hoped what she was about to do would work. Just before the girl went to launch from the rail, however, she froze, eyes wide. Out of the corner of her vision, she'd seen something that made her halt in place. Nami slowly turned and couldn't help but gape at what she saw floating out on the water. "Was that the Mary? Thanks for the food," Luffy exclaimed, stuffing his face with apples. "You said your name was Cody, right?" He turned and looked at the pink-haired boy watching him eat, almost choking on a piece of apple from laughing at the sight. He looked funny. The other occupant of the room was short and stumpy with pink bull-like hair parted down the middle. On his round face, he wore a pair of circular glasses and he seemed to almost be trying to hide behind them, somehow. His clothes consisted of a white t-shirt with 3 black stripes on each shoulder, long black pants, and a similarly colored pair of shoes. "It's actually Kobe," the boy replied as he watched the other teen eat with his mouth still hanging open in shock. What was going on? He glanced back at the door and his eyes found the 2 unconscious men lying there, his vision shifting back to the straw-hatted boy. Kobe had been in the kitchen trying to escape having to board the cruise liner that was currently being looted when the strange boy barged in out of nowhere. He was ashamed that he'd screamed when he'd heard the door open, but he didn't know who to expect when he turned around. He could honestly say, though, it certainly wasn't who was actually there. "Thanks for the meal, Katie," Luffy said, patting his stomach, a loud belch leaving his lips. Those apples were really tasty. The pink-kid's jaw seemed to drop even further, if possible, making the boy laugh. Was this kid some kind of monster? How had he eaten every single one of those apples? The box had been completely full. "It's actually Kobe," he repeated, meekly. Luffy laughed brightly at the look on the other kid's face before standing up and dusting apple crumbs off his jeans. "I really appreciate the food, Cobb," the black-haired boy said genuinely, loosening up his shoulder. "But I gotta beat you up now." He came here to fight and he was gonna do just that. This kid had fed him so he wouldn't beat him up too bad. Kobe immediately scrambled away with a look of fear on his face, tripping over a pile of boxes and falling to the ground. The pink-kid scrambled to get to his feet but couldn't. He ended up just turning to sit on the ground, sliding away from the boy with the straw hat as he slowly approached. He began to frantically wave his hands in front of his body. Hey, You don't need to beat me up. I don't even want to be here, and again, it's Kobe. The words made Luffy pause. What's that mean? If he didn't want to be there, then why was he still there? Kobe slowly lowered his hands when HWAS no longer poised to strike him. I just mean that, he was having trouble figuring out how to word it the right way. I mean that I was never supposed to be here in the first place. Luffy gave the pink-haired boy a side-eyed look but made no move to interrupt. About 2 years ago, when I still lived in my hometown, I went out to go fishing, Kobe explained, morosely. However, instead of getting on the fishing boat, I got on the boat taking people to this pirate ship. He finished, looking down at the ground in shame. Luffy burst into laughter at the story. You must be some kind of idiot, Coley, the straw-hatted teen exclaimed, continuing to giggle while Kobe hung his head in shame. After a moment, he got a handle on himself and asked a question, so, if you came here by accident, why stay? The pinkett seemed to hang his head further, if possible. To be honest, I'm just too scared, I don't want her to kill me, he replied honestly. And, it's not Coley. It's Kobe. The boy pouted, continuing to hang his head. So, you're a coward? Luffy asked like he already knew the answer, crossing his arms in front of his body. He honestly wanted to hit this kid. I kinda hate guys like you. Guys like you are too scared to chase their dreams just because they might die, he said, plainly. Kobe's head seemed to somehow lower even further, but he did manage to ask a question in return. A good bit of skepticism to his voice, and you're not? The pirate captain didn't even need to think about the answer, flashing his signature smile, as long I'm chasing my dream, I don't care when I die. Kobe looked up with wide eyes and was met with the face of someone who meant every word they said. What exactly is your dream? The question seemed to make him smile bigger if that was even possible. Listen up, coward boy. Luffy said, his eyes set ablaze by the flames that fueled his dream. My name's Monkey D. Luffy. He uncrossed his arms and screamed his next words as if intending for the entire world to hear, and I'm gonna be the king of the pirates. The other occupant of the room looked at the boy wearing the straw hat incredulously. You can't be serious. The Pirate King is the one who has everything the world has to offer. Almost every pirate in the world is vying for that title. No way. No way. No way. It's simply impose. A palm smacked into the back of Kobe's head, interrupting him, and he held it in pain, looking up at his offender. What the heck do you do that for? You were being annoying, Luffy replied, matter-of-factly. But I was just telling the truth. Again, the pinkett's words were cut short as another palm connected with his head. Why do you keep doing that? He asked the straw-hatted teen, moaning in pain. You were being annoying, Luffy repeated in the same tone as before. But, Luffy, you could die if you pursue being the Pirate King, desperately reasoned Kobe, trying to make him understand. The pirate captain shot him a blank look. So? What do you mean, so? The pink-haired teen yelled frantically. Don't you care about your life at all? I already told you already, Cowie. Luffy grinned. Nothing is gonna stop me from chasing my dream. He turned and walked away, effectively ending the conversation, not even death. Just as he went to open the door, the coward's voice stopped him. Wait, Kobe yelled, standing to his feet. He looked up from the ground and into Luffy's eyes. Do you think I could chase my dream? He asked shakily. And please, it's Kobe, he added, more softly than he meant to. Luffy turned back around, his hand dropping from the handle of the door. Why you asking me? He looked at the other occupant of the room seriously. The only person who can make that decision is you. The seriousness on his face immediately melted away and his smile once again found its way there. All it takes is a little bit of courage. Then I'll do it, the pinkett yelled. He didn't know where all the confidence was coming from, but for some reason, Luffy's words had spurred him on. He was tired of being on this damn ship. He was tired of being everyone's lapdog. And mostly, he was tired of that damn hag, Alvida. I'll do it, Kobe screamed into the air. Hearing the words come out of his mouth, he'd never felt so powerful, continuing his tirade. I'll do it. I'll become the greatest marine that's ever lived. I'll bring justice to all the evil pirates on the sea, starting with. The kitchen door blasted into pieces and interrupted whatever it was the boy was going to say. A large figure slowly walking through the dust. Starting with who? Kobe. The sound of a deep voice came. A woman so large Luffy's jaw dropped. stepped through the door and sent a menacing glare in Kobe's direction. The woman was very obese, yet tall, with long wavy black hair, freckles on her round cheeks, and dark red lipstick covering her lips. On her head, she wore a white cowgirl hat with a large red plume, and around her neck was a red neckerchief. Covering her upper body was a pink plaid shirt with a blue captain's coat over it, her arms in the sleeves unlike many other pirates. Most of her fingers were adorned with large rings and her long sharp fingernails were painted with blood-red nail polish. Her legs were covered by a pair of long graying pants that sat on top of a pair of red shoes with gold buckles. The last thing of note was a purple sash tied around her considerable waist where she kept a flintlock pistol tucked. Kobe scrambled backward in fear as he saw the fat body of Alvida coming through the door, frantically waving his hands in front of him. "Oh. No need to worry about it, Lady Alvida." "No, I'd like to hear what you were going to say," the fat lady demanded, her eyes never leaving the pink kids. Before he even had the chance to respond, Luffy's voice piped up, "Hey, Corey, who? My name is Kobe, damn it," the irate boy screamed before he could stop himself, slapping his hand over his mouth. The pirate captain grinned in Kobe's direction before shooting his hands into the air in mock surrender. "Well then, Kobe." He knew there was some fire somewhere in there. "I wanted to ask who this fat hag was," he said, causally pointing in Alvida's direction. The room went deathly quiet for several moments, the other two occupants of the room staring at the straw-hatted boy with wide eyes and open mouths. Luffy looked between the two, cluelessly. "Was it something I said?" he innocently asked. Alvida was boiling. She couldn't even move, she was so angry. No one, absolutely no one, called her fat. The woman's breathing began to speed up. She needed the truth and she needed it now before she exploded from the pure unadulterated rage. She needed someone to tell her how beautiful she was. The woman's eyes locked on Kobe's and she knew she'd found her saving grace. Surely he would tell her the truth like he always did. "Kobe," she said, an unhealthy amount of vitriol hiding just on the edge of her voice. "Who is the most beautiful woman on the seas?" Kobe's wide eyes couldn't leave Alvida's while he listened to her question, sitting there frozen in fear. "Yo," the boy stopped himself in the middle of his reply. "I already told you already, Cowie." Luffy grinned. "Nothing is gonna stop me from chasing my dream." He turned and walked away from the other occupant of the room, not even death. "What was that, Kobe?" Alvida asked, in a surgery-sweet tone that somehow still seemed to drip with poison. The pink-haired boy's heart was beginning to beat faster. Was this his moment? His chance to really take his first step toward his dream? Kobe tore his gaze away from Alvida's momentarily and swung it in Luffy's direction. As their eyes connected and he saw the smile the straw-hatted boy was sending him, he felt like his heart was lit ablaze. A thought passed through his mind and it only made his choice that much easier. If he didn't fight for his dream, who would? With his mind and heart in harmony, onked away from Luffy and carried his eyes back to Alvida's large form. The pinkett matched the woman's glare with his own before closing his eyes and taking a deep breath. When he opened them, all the turmoil in them had disappeared and he sent Alvida a small smile. "Alvida, you are." The large woman closed her eyes in preparation for her praise as she listened to the pink-haired boy speak. Any moment now he would tell her how beautiful she was. His compliments would burn that little brat's insulting words straight out of her brain. Any second now the words would be coming. Any second now, any second. "You are the fattest, most ugly whale I have ever had the displeasure of looking at. There is no one fatter or uglier in the entire sea. You hag," Kobe screamed with all of the courage he had in his little body. Luffy burst into laughter at the words, holding his stomach in humor-induced pain and trying not to fall over. "Nice one, Kobe." "Kobe," growled Alvida, her iron mace creaking under her grip. The pink-haired boy looked up, all of his courage being once again replaced by fear, and closed his eyes so he didn't have to watch the woman take his life. If he died for his dream, then so what? It was better than living a life he hated. "You're about to find out firsthand why they call me Iron Mace Alvida," the fat woman screamed, bringing her mace down with every ounce of anger and strength in her large body. Luffy's laughter immediately stopped and he calmly stepped in between Alvida and Kobe, raising his arm above his head. The iron mace slammed into his palm with a loud smack and he winced slightly, feeling spikes dig into his hand. He didn't think they'd broken the skin, but it still hurt a little. He watched in amusement as Alvida's eyes went from rage to glee, back to rage, and then to what he could only assume was fear. He gripped the woman's weapon tightly and easily ripped it from her grasp. Kobe gaped at seeing Luffy now holding Alvida's mace. He had caught it and overpowered her, with one hand. Just exactly how strong was Luffy? The straw-hatted teen tested the weight of the spiked club before shrugging and launching it directly at ceiling. The metal impacted the wood, sending a crack into the air, and it tore straight through without even losing that much speed. Luffy listened for a moment before smiling when he heard a small splash in the distance. "My mace!" Alvida screamed, immediately turning and making her way out of the room as fast as she could. Her baby was drowning. She had to find it, save it. She was nothing without her mace. The two teenage boys both watched the fat lady leave, one in amusement and the other in shock. "That was pretty cool, Kobe," Luffy complimented, breaking the pink kid out of his stupor. Kobe looked back and a shy smile rose to his face. It felt good to fight. "Now, how about we get outta here?" the straw-hatted teen suggested. He eyed the broken door and then the hole above his head. First though," the red-vested teen laughed, "I gotta do what I came here to do." Kobe didn't understand the words at first, but they began to make more sense when he watched Luffy jump through the hole in the ceiling and immediately heard screaming coming from above. As soon as his feet hit solid ground again, the straw-hatted teen was on the attack, a big battle-fueled smile glued to his face. Passing his first opponent, Luffy's fist snaked out into the man's temple, his body slamming into the deck and straight through it to whatever was below. Another of the teen's fists struck out and he felt the snap of a nose as a man was sent flying into the mast, severely cracking it. He dodged a vertical sword swipe and spun into the air, the outside of his right foot slamming into the pirate's head. The man folded and smashed straight through the deck, the straw-hatted teen already on the move again. Luffy jumped through the air, shattering the wood beneath him, and pointed his toe in the direction of two approaching men. Bone and skin parted as his sandal met the chest of the first man, the leg pushing out of the pirate's back with enough momentum to go through the second man's chest just as easily. While still moving through the air, the teen used his other leg to push off the bodies in the opposite direction and his blood-soaked appendage came free, a wet squelch sounding into the air. More enemies continued to rush at him after he landed, his right leg now painted red, and his smile seemed to keep getting larger. He absolutely loved fighting. Black eyes shifted back to the two dead men for a moment, a multitude of footsteps rumbling against the wooden deck in the background. He hadn't really meant to kill them, but then again, he hadn't really been trying not to either. He shrugged to himself and turned back to the approaching pirates, the grin never leaving his face. Luffy's form flashed forward and he began to blur around the deck of the pirate ship, both dead and unconscious bodies flying everywhere. Sun Palm. Luffy screamed, his curled right hand slamming into the chest of a pirate aiming a pistol at his head. Impact. The sound of bones shattering hit the air at the same time as the man's gargling screams, blood falling from his mouth like a waterfall. His body flew in the opposite direction and was skewered on another man's swords, both smashing into the ground with a crash. The straw-hatted teen tore his eyes away and stopped moving as he was surrounded on all sides. Before any of the men could slash at him with their swords, he launched into the air, snapping the wood beneath him. His body rotated and he couldn't help but laugh a little at all the easy targets on the boat. Gatling! Luffy roared, punching the air as hard and fast as he could. The still conscious pirates on the boat could only stare in horror at what was coming. There were so many air bullets raining down from the sky that, even though they were almost invisible, it looked like a wall of white descending upon them. Loud cracks of shattering wood and screams of pain sounded into the air as Luffy continued in his onslaught before halting the rapid movement of his fists and beginning to fall back to the now destroyed deck of the ship. No need to overdo it. His sandals found broken planks and he looked around in amazement. Had he really done all this? Looked like he overdid it. The main deck was practically gone, putting multiple unconscious men in some very precarious positions. The straw-hatted teen shrugged his shoulders uncaringly, his eyes drifting to the large masts of the vessel looking like they were about to fall over. As if on cue, multiple small cracking sounds rose into the air and all three masts of the ship began to tilt in directions that they certainly weren't supposed to. Luffy watched in amazement as the large wooden poles continued to tilt until they could tilt no more, 3 loud snaps sounding into the air. The teen didn't even watch as the large pieces of wood smacked into the water, being distracted by a loud thump from close to the barely still intact railing. His eyes gazed in the direction of the sound and they widened when they found what had made it. The whale's mace. A wet hand slapped onto the railing closest to the weapon and slowly but surely a figure began to pull itself back onto the boat. Luffy looked on in shock as Alvida picked up the heavy metal weapon and began taking slow measured steps in his direction. Dark mascara dripped from the wet woman's eyes while she dragged her mace on the destroyed deck, the friction sending a terrible screeching sound into the air. "You die," the fat woman whispered, her face dropping toward the ground in anger. She made no move to stop or speed up, she simply kept slowly approaching. As if suddenly possessed, Alvida's head snapped up and a scream of rage pierced through the air, her mace somehow already above her and ready to turn her enemy into a bloody paste. Luffy's posture stayed relaxed while the spiked club moved downward, his eyes watching and waiting for the reach the mace would have connected with his head. The straw-hatted boy shifted just enough for the iron weapon to miss him by millimeters, cracking the deck where he'd previously stood. By the time Alvida registered the fact that she'd missed her target, it was already too late. Luffy was inside her guard with his fist barred. The whale-like woman's eyes widened when they were suddenly met with her opponent's blinding white smile. The smile of the first man to ever strike her. The boy's fist shot forward, cracking through the air and it smashed into the center of the large woman's stomach, sinking into the fat as the skin rippled like waves around the point of impact. The two stayed still for a moment, seemingly at a stalemate, before a large boom sounded and the fat woman literally blasted off before Luffy's very eyes. He watched her form fly through the air in amazement and it somehow seemed to just keep going higher, eventually disappearing from his sight altogether. Shrugging to himself, Luffy turned away and began to walk back to the kitchen with a sigh. That had been fun. However, it was unnecessary as the person he was going to retrieve was already present on the deck, looking at him with eyes as wide as saucers. "You want a ride?" he asked the shell-shocked boy. It was just a punch, he didn't need to get all worked up about it. Kobe shook himself out of his shock at the boy's words. He still couldn't really believe he'd just seen that. "If you wouldn't mind, I'd really appreciate it," the pink-haired boy answered with a bow. The pirate captain laughed at the gesture, as it was completely unnecessary, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he casually approached Kobe and grabbed the back of his shirt, the boy shooting him a curious look. He picked him up with one hand and began to look around the area, testing his weight. If he remembered correctly, the ship was. He turned and walked to the opposite railing, looking toward the back end of the mostly destroyed craft he stood on. In the distance, he could see Mary and that was all he needed. Luffy?" Kobe nervously asked, still being held in the air by the back of his shirt. "What are you doing?" The straw-hatted teen didn't answer the question. Instead, he cocked his arm back and launched it forward with as much strength as he could muster. The pinket's screams echoed down to him as the boy flew through the air toward his lovely lamb-headed vessel, but he wasn't even watching. He stepped up on the rail and dove into the water, beginning to swim in the same direction. Somehow, Luffy managed to catch up to Kobe before the younger boy could make it to the Mary and he left him in the dust. He wasn't waiting on slowpokes. As he neared his ship, though, he noticed something odd. A small boat was anchored to it. The same small boat he saw anchored to the big white ship earlier. The black-haired teen quickly made his way up the side of the Mary but tried to stay quiet as he stepped back onto the deck. His eyes scanned the entirety of his surroundings but he didn't see anything. Luffy slowly walked the main deck and just when he passed the mast, he could have sworn he heard something from beneath his feet. He slowly made his way over to the hatch right next to the large wooden pole, the entrance to the men's quarters, and lightly got down to his knees, softly placing his ear on top it. Where the hell would they have put it? His body almost recoiled when the voice traveled into his ear, quickly standing to his feet and wrenching the hatch open, a sharp gasp coming from inside. The red-vested boy practically jumped down the hole, his sandals slamming into the floor of the men's quarters. It didn't take long for him to find the intruder as she was frozen in place and staring right at him. He almost wasn't able to find his voice. He hadn't seen her since she left. Just what the hell was she doing back on the Mary? He wasn't all that upset about it but he was very confused. Luffy shot the girl a look that said he still couldn't believe she was standing there, his voice filled with disbelief. Nami? Chapter 26. Surprises and Shells. Nami? Luffy asked incredulously. He knew he'd see her again, but he never expected her to just show up on the ship. The orangeite remained frozen, unable to keep her eyes from drinking in the sight of the straw-hatted boy in front of her. He's grown, she thought to herself as she roamed Luffy's form. She'd seen him whenever he was in the news, but it hadn't really hit her until after seeing him in person. The jeans were new. Her vision hovered over them for a moment before she decided that she liked them. They made him look a bit older. Actually, everything about him looked older, especially his actual body. When they'd traveled together, he'd been a lot skinnier. And now, she couldn't lie to herself, he looked good. Luffy! A voice screamed, interrupting the staring match between the two. Help, there's a sea monster. Luffy's eyes widened. Levi didn't know who Kobe was. He might actually eat him. The straw-hatted teen shot Nami a look that said, "Don't go anywhere," before rushing up the ladder to the main deck. Only his head had made it out of the hatch, and he could already hear the pink-haired boy's desperate splashes as he screamed bloody murder. He pulled himself up and rushed to the rail as quickly as he could. Levi, friend, not food. A moment passed, Kobe still splashing like his life depended on it, before rumbling came from the water and the boy sighed in relief, smiling at where he knew his large friend was swimming. Sorry, buddy. Didn't mean to get you all riled up. His response was more rumbles that made him laugh. Yeah. Luffy waved Levi away and looked at Kobe still splashing and screaming in the water. Kobe, he yelled in the boy's direction. He won't hurt you, he's my friend. The splashes and screams suddenly stopped and Kobe sent a bewildered look in his direction before shaking his head and quickly swimming toward the ship. That beast of yours is still around, I see, Nami said from behind, having just climbed out of the men's quarters. The boy whirled around and his black eyes were once again met with a pair of brown ones. Now that the shock was gone, he realized that he hadn't seen the orangeite in a really long time, and a smile made its way onto his face. Nami couldn't lie to herself. She'd missed that smile, and seeing it again was making her heart ache something fierce. Luffy suddenly rushed in the girl's direction, the grin never leaving his face. Nami, I missed you, he exclaimed, grabbing her up in a hug and holding her for a moment. As the two stood there, as excited as he was to see her again, he couldn't help but feel like something just wasn't quite right. Nami? He curiously asked, loosening his grip and taking a step back to look at her. Nami smiled as he looked at her, trying to hide the turmoil she was feeling inside. She just didn't know what to do. On the one hand, she considered him a friend, but, on the other, he was a pirate now. Her eyes glanced up at the Jolly Roger painted on the mast, and she hated the fact that she liked it. She didn't want to like it. She wanted to hate it. She wanted to hate it because she hated pirates. Brown orbs met black once again, and, try as she might, the orange-haired girl just couldn't bring herself to feel any animosity toward who she was looking at. She sighed to herself. So, you're a pirate now, the orangeite stated, escaping from the arms surrounding her and walking toward the port side railing. Luffy watched Nami walk away with a frown, continuing as she leaned over it and looked out to sea. Yeah, he replied without his usual enthusiasm. For some reason, it just didn't feel right getting excited about it at the moment, and he didn't really know why. Thought you'd be happier about it, the girl mused, not moving her gaze from the sea. He didn't reply because, well, honestly, he just didn't have one. She was different from who he remembered. More like the person he'd met on East Lodestone. He didn't know why or how he even really knew. He just knew that she felt different than the girl he'd parted with all those months ago. What the hell was that thing? Luffy, Kobe exclaimed, huffing. He pulled himself over the starboard side railing and lay on the deck to catch his breath, the water from his soaked clothes darkening the wood underneath. That had been the scariest thing to ever happen to him. He'd never seen a sea creature that big before. He shivered at remembering how close he'd come to being eaten, immediately cleansing the thoughts from his mind, and turned to look at the boy he'd addressed. Instead of being met with Luffy, the pinket's eyes first found another figure standing at the opposite rail. It was a girl. Luffy turned to Kobe and the frown disappeared from his face and was replaced with a laughing smile. Sorry, Kobe. That's my friend Levi. He thought you were food. The straw-hatted teen smiled sheepishly and shrugged. But he didn't eat you, and now he knows you're a friend. Kobe's eyes widened at the word, friend. He'd never really had any friends before. Why did he want to be his friend anyway? They'd only just met recently, and if he remembered correctly, Luffy said he hated guys like him. He was so blown away by being called a friend that he completely glossed over the part about his other friend. Of course, Luffy exclaimed with a laugh, missing Nami's form tightening slightly at the conversation. I thought it was really cool when you stood up to that whale even though you were scared. Plus, what you said to her was hilarious. The boy smiled at the words, sitting up. Now that he had more time to think about it, it was finally hitting him. Kobe stared at his hands like they were new. He was finally free to chase his dream. Thanks, Luffy. He finally replied, looking up at his new friend. As heartwarming as this is, I think it's about time I get out of here, Nami interjected, finally turning around and making her way in Kobe's direction. She went to pass Luffy and stopped in place when he stepped in front of her. The Orangeite didn't say anything, simply looked at the straw-hatted boy and waited for him to speak. Stay, Luffy said, looking Nami dead in the eyes. The orange-haired girl scoffed at the statement, staring right back. I told you, I'm never back. I'm not asking you that right now. The black-haired boy interrupted, seriously, his eyes never leaving hers. I'm just asking you to stay. He didn't want her to be alone. The words made Nami pause, but, honestly, they also made her hurt so much worse inside. She needed to get off this ship before she said something she regretted. The only problem was, she was being stopped from doing just that. Move, Luffy, she said, breaking the eye contact. I'm leaving. Why get on the Mary at all then? Luffy genuinely asked, throwing his hands in the air with a slight bit of irritation. Nami was honestly surprised the question even came up. She was kind of expecting to be able to get out of there without having to explain herself, but maybe if he knew why she was there, he would let her go. I was stealing from you, she answered, looking back up and giving Luffy a hard stare. You guys did pretty well as bounty hunters. I thought maybe you had some money stashed around here. I was also looking for the gold we stole from Mad Treasure. Thought you might have had some left. Honestly, they were both pretty weak excuses when she thought about it. Mad Treasure? Kobe slapped his hand over his mouth. He hadn't meant to say that out loud. He was just shocked. Mad Treasure was a pirate from the Grand Line. If they'd stolen from him. His eyes drifted to Luffy and he couldn't help but wonder just who the straw-hatted boy really was. Luffy was so confused by Nami's words that he completely missed Kobe's accidental outburst. While they were bounty hunting, they didn't make a lot of money. Most of the time they had to use what they would have made to pay for the repairs of a lot of things. The part that was the treasure part. Why would Nami be looking for the treasure? If she wanted his, then why didn't she just take it then, like he thought she would? If you want it, take it, Luffy said, still not understanding why she hadn't just taken it all in the first place. Nami's eyes widened. What the hell was he talking about? What do you mean? She asked, confused. Did they still have some left? Take it, the boy repeated, pointing up the stairs into the galley. The Orangeite followed his finger and, somehow, became even more confused. Why the hell was he pointing toward the galley? What, did you hide it in the fridge? She asked incredulously, shaking her head in amusement. Luffy was suddenly smiling big again and it took her a moment to figure out why, her hand coming up to touch her mouth. She was smiling, and it was a real one. It had been so long that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like. Obviously I didn't hide it in the fridge, that's where food goes, the straw-hatted teen laughed. Nami smiled again. It felt nice. Good to know. So where did you put it? She asked. If he was serious about letting her have the rest of his treasure, she certainly wasn't going to say no. She needed every penny she could get, and even then, she still wasn't sure it would matter. I bought a second one and put the treasure in there, explained Luffy with a laugh. He tried to fit all his treasure in the first fridge before realizing he couldn't fit it in with the food. So, when they had the chance, he, Zoro, and Usopp had picked up a second one. What? It was a good hiding place. Who was gonna look for treasure in a refrigerator? It did have its downsides though. He sometimes went to the wrong one while he was asleep. Nami stared at the straw-hatted boy blankly. She should have known better than to think he'd hide it in a reasonable place. And you're just gonna give it to me? She asked in slight disbelief. Sure. I spend some of it on meat here and there, when Zoro isn't around, but he usually pays for everything anyway. Luffy replied, nodding his head in the direction of the galley. It's waiting for you in there, so go grab it." The orange-haired girl wasn't going to question any further. There was no world in which she refused free money. She sent the boy another small smile, reveling in the feeling for a moment, before making her way up the stairs and eventually reaching the door of the galley. She was honestly a little excited at wondering how much treasure might be left. As soon as the door shut behind the girl, Luffy sprinted in Kobe's direction, moving past him to hang over the starboard railing. "Levi," he yelled into the water. Kobe watched in curiosity as the sea beast's head poked out of the water, and his friend immediately began to whisper while making hand signals as quickly as he could. What exactly was he doing? The boy shook his head, focusing back in quickly enough to see Levi nod his large head and sink back beneath the water. The door to the galley opened and the straw-hatted teen turned away from the sea as quickly as he could, facing the stairs while Nami descended them with a medium-sized cloth sack hanging off her shoulder. He nervously wiped the sweat from his brow. "Find it all right?" Nami looked at the boy and something about him just felt off. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, though. She continued to look for a moment longer before shrugging her shoulders. It didn't really matter, she was leaving. With the treasure, she was almost back to 100 million berries. The sound of wood violently cracking shot into the air and froze the orangeade in place momentarily. "What the hell is that?" she yelled, hurrying her way over to the rail. Before she could make it all the way, a boy wearing a straw hat stepped in front of her. "I'm sure it's nothing," Luffy said, nervously whistling as the cracking still sounded in the background. She paid him no mind and he didn't try to stop her from stepping around him, simply hanging his head like he'd been caught in something. As the orangeade stepped up and looked over the railing, Luffy's head snapped to the sky in irritation. "Damn it, Levi," I said, "do it quietly." Nami let the hot water from the shower head above run through her hair, softly massaging soap into her orange locks and washing away all the oils and dried sweat they'd accumulated. The orangeade couldn't help but sigh in satisfaction at feeling the warm liquid surrounding her body. The aches in her muscles were starting to fade and a soft smile was growing on her face. It was crazy. She'd only been back on the Mary for a couple of days now and she was already starting to remember why she loved it so much. For some reason, it felt like home, her old home. The one she lived in before Arlong ruined everything. She just felt so comfortable there. Almost like it was where she was supposed to be. Nami sighed again, sinking slightly deeper into the bath. She was still pissed at Luffy but, at the same time, she wasn't really. A part of her was glad to be stuck on the ship and she had no idea how to feel about it. If she was being honest, she was a little upset with herself. The Mary always made her want to stay and forget about Arlong. But she knew she could never do that. The girl groaned in turmoil, shaking her head and reaching over to turn the water off. The next stop would be Shell's Town, if Luffy was to be believed, and she would be making her exit there. At least she would try to. She wasn't sure Luffy would let her. The thought didn't make her very upset, honestly. If she didn't have to leave, she probably never would. But that wasn't an option. Nami leaned her head on the back of the small bathtub and stared at the ceiling. She'd been on the boat for less than a week and she'd already smiled more than she had in almost half a year. The orangeade huffed, lightly slapping at the surrounding water in irritation. Why did Luffy have to be the way he was? Why couldn't he just be like every other pirate in the world so she could hate him? It would make things so much easier. But, no, he made her laugh and smile so much that it was almost infuriating. And yet at the same time, another smile made its way onto Nami's face and she didn't even try to wipe it away as a thought crossed her mind. She wouldn't want him to be any different. Instead of continuing to think about topics that were confusing to her, the girl instead chose to dunk her head beneath the surface of the water. She'd done enough thinking and there was nothing she could do about her situation right now anyway. She might as well just live with it and try to make an exit as early as possible. Even with Luffy's leftover treasure, she hadn't quite hit her goal yet and, with that being said, still had a map to the Grand Line to find. With a decision made, Nami continued her bath, her mind in relative peace as her head pushed back through the surface of the water. She really hoped he wouldn't make a big deal about her leaving again. "That's it," Kobe exclaimed from next to Luffy, who was sitting in his place and steering the boat. The straw-hatted teen turned in curiosity. "What?" he mumbled through his, somehow, still swollen face. It had been days already. The pinkett winced at seeing the bruises. Nami had really done a number on him. He shook his head and got back to his previous thought. Your Straw Hat Luffy of Mary's terrible trio. It had taken him a while to figure it out, but even when he'd met him he thought he knew Luffy from somewhere. He didn't even think of making the connection at first because he'd introduced himself as a pirate. But, after listening to him call this ship Mary and getting a good look at the figurehead, it clicked. Oh, yeah. Luffy replied nonchalantly, his swollen face turning forward again. He was done with bounty hunting, as fun as it had been. He was a pirate now. There were 2 more in your group, right? The pink-haired boy asked, racking his brain for their name Hunter Zoro and Long Barrel Usopp. At the mention of his friends, the straw-hatted teen smiled. Yep. He answered, popping the P and groaning when it hurt his bruised lip. He still couldn't help but laugh lightly at the memories he'd made with his 2 friends. We weren't very good at it. Kobe looked at his friend incredulously. What do you mean you weren't good at it? You guys cashed in almost all of the bounties in the East Blue? There are only a couple of real pirate crews left and they're the biggest on this sea. He paused for a moment. I even started hoping you guys would come after Alvida. Yeah, we never got around to him. The black-haired boy replied. As for the whale, I'm not sure I ever even saw her poster. It was also quite possible that as soon as he'd seen it, he'd erased it from his memory. He shook the terrible image of the woman from his head and began to laugh thinking about the destruction they'd caused while on the job. And, we weren't good at it 'cause we didn't actually make that much money. The words quieted the aspiring Marine. He did remember reading about how much damage they would cause in the pursuit of bounties. When he thought about it, it wasn't all that surprising that they'd made no money. Thinking of the paper, though, he remembered something else he'd read. Is Pirate Hunter Zoro really as ruthless as they say? He paused to let Luffy reply but remembered something else. Oh. And I heard Long Barrel Usopp can hit 20 men with 1 shot of his slingshot. The straw-hatted boy smiled at the horizon. Nah, Zoro's not ruthless. Not if you're his friend. I think he's a pretty nice guy, even if he doesn't want people to know it. And if you're not his friend? Kobe asked, gulping. A laugh rose from Luffy's throat. Yeah, then it might be a little true. The picture of Zoro in his mind was replaced with a familiar long-nosed boy. As for Usopp, he thought for a moment on the validity of Kobe's statement before he remembered. It was kind of a technicality but he counted it nonetheless. It's true. I've seen it, he stated simply. The pink-haired boy's eyes widened in wonder. Are those 2 gonna be on your crew? He curiously asked. It seemed like a no-brainer to him. Unless they didn't want to, of course. However, he didn't think it was likely they'd say no if he was being honest with himself. If Luffy asked him right now he didn't know what he'd say, and that was coming from someone who wanted to be a Marine. Kobe shook the thought away, turning in the direction of the deck just as Nami walked out with a towel on her head. Luffy, I'm leaving when we get to Shells. The Orangeite said, stepping up the stairs to the front deck, and don't try to stop me. She had on short unbuttoned jean shorts over a pair of bikini bottoms and a white shirt covering the bikini's top, the stripped multicolored fabric just barely showing through. Kobe had to physically hold his nose to make sure no blood came out. Even with the towel, he wasn't sure he'd ever seen someone so pretty in his life, let alone curves like that. It was quite the change from the image of Alvida he'd had to live with over the past 2 years. Luffy turned in the girl's direction with a pout. Oh, come on, Nami. He just didn't understand why she was so adamant about not staying on the Mary. The Mary was great. The girl shot a withering glare that silenced him immediately and he turned back out to the sea continuing to pout. Nami sent Kobe a look that said, "You're in my seat." And he immediately stood. She smiled at him and sat down where he'd been previously sitting, reclaiming her chair with a sigh. She'd missed tanning out on the front deck. The Orangeite unwrapped the towel on her head, her damp locks falling to just above her shoulders, and slipped out of the shorts covering her lower body while removing her top. I'm gonna go to the galley and make myself something to eat, Kobe squeaked, turning on his heel and running down to the main deck. He needed to be somewhere other than the place he was. If he remained, blood would surely start leaking from his nose. Let's not even talk about his lower body. Nami watched the boy leave, curiously, wondering why he was in such a hurry to go. She shrugged her shoulders and closed her eyes under her dark sunglasses, trying to get relaxed. Just when she'd finally found the right spot, a voice came from in front of her, immediately making her sit back up. "Land ho!" Luffy shouted. It was small in the distance but it was definitely there. Zoro was right there. "Levi, let's get there quick, buddy," he yelled to down below, "but don't hurt the Mary." In response, a rumble came from the water and the ship began to move a little faster toward its destination. Nami raised the glasses on her face to squint in the direction the straw-hatted teen was looking. She couldn't see anything but she believed him. She knew how good his vision was. Shrugging to herself, the orangeette pushed her sunglasses back down. If she still couldn't see it, it would be a little longer until they arrived. Until then, she was going to lie in the sun. She hadn't had a peaceful moment in her mind like this in a very long time and she wasn't going to waste it. She could think about the growing pit in her stomach when they arrived on the island. "Luffy," a brown-haired woman exclaimed, running up to the boy leading the group that had just walked through the doors to her bar. The straw-hatted teen froze when he entered, Nami and Kobe almost running into his back. "What the hell, Lou?" Nami began, being interrupted by the woman before she could finish. Ririka skid to a halt in front of Luffy and his friends. "It's Rika. I can't find her anywhere. I think she might have gone to see Zoro." Luffy heard the words and didn't understand them. What would be so bad about Rika going to see Zoro? It took him a moment but he eventually realized that the swordsman wasn't there, where they were supposed to meet. "He's being held prisoner at the marine base," the brown-haired woman frantically explained. "He'd just been protecting her daughter from that terrible Helmeppo's wolf. He didn't deserve to be put through what that boy was doing to him. The captain of the marine base here has a son named Helmeppo." She began to explain. "He came in, maybe a day or two after you left, with his wolf. It was wrecking everything but Zoro didn't do anything other than watch because I told him not to. Then the wolf had gone after Rika, and you can probably guess the rest." Kobe's eyes widened, the bar's doors still swinging behind him and Nami. Did this Helmeppo get in trouble too? He just couldn't see how he would be able to get away with doing what he did. His father was the captain of the marine base, for goodness sake. Nami scoffed in the Pinket's direction. "Yeah, I'll bet he's in the cell right next to Zoro," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Kobe looked at the girl like he didn't understand her words. He went to respond but was pulled back to the conversation between Luffy and Ririka before he got the chance. "Is the kid dead?" Luffy asked, curiously, wondering if Zoro had killed him too. Honestly, he was surprised his soon-to-be first mate had even let himself be taken. Ririka dropped her gaze to her feet in shame. "No, Zoro. I could tell he probably wanted to, but Helmeppo threatened to have the bar closed down and that was enough to get him to go quietly. Honestly, she'd been scared that he would kill him anyway. She just knew what he'd been thinking. How could he close the bar if he was dead?" The woman's head seemed to drop even further before it shot back up, panic in her eyes. "I think Rika might have gone to see him. She's always wanting to bring him food but I've told her no every time she's asked. I think she may have just gone without asking this time." "Wait, I'm confused." Nami chimed in, stepping beside Luffy. "Where exactly is the green-haired idiot?" she asked. If Zoro was in a cell, him food without easily getting caught. Also, why would she want to bring him food in the first place? Surely they weren't starving him, right? "They have him tied up in the yard of the local marine base," Ririka answered, looking at Nami before turning back and addressing Luffy once again. "Helmeppo made a deal with him. If he could go 30 days without eating, he would be pardoned and the bar would be safe." Luffy gaped at the woman's words. 30 days? He didn't think he'd be able to go one whole day without food, let alone 30 of them. The woman nodded her head in confirmation before getting back to her point. "Every day Rika asks to bring him food but I don't want her to get hurt or in trouble so I kept telling her no," she explained. "I think she may have gone without asking today and that scares me." Ririka looked up at Luffy with a pleading smile. "Would you please go check for her, Luffy? Gives you a chance to go see Zoro too." The straw-hatted teen seemed to think it was a great idea from the big smile he sent her. "Come on guys. Let's go see if we can find Rika," Luffy shouted, turning on his heel. Kobe was all for it. He wasn't sure the Marines would do anything to the girl, they were Marines after all, but after hearing Ririka's story, checking probably wouldn't hurt, just in case. Nami turned and followed the two boys out of the bar, thinking she needed to find a boat to replace the one Levi had destroyed so she could leave and head toward Organ Island. If the rumors going around the past couple of weeks were true, Buggy the Clown was currently there in a place called Orangetown. Hopefully, he actually had a map to Reverse Mountain and it wasn't made up. The three's footsteps came upon the marine base just as voices started to echo from behind the wall surrounding the yard. "You dumb little girl, onigiri is supposed to be made with salt, not sugar, only an idiot would do something like that," a high-pitched male's voice complained. The three looked at each other for a moment before each began to climb the wall, their eyes peeking over when they made it to the top. In the middle of the yard were Zoro and a few others. One of them was Rika and another was who the three assumed to be Helmeppo. Well, two of them did. Luffy just thought the kid looked like an idiot but had no idea who he was. He barely listened to Ririka's story. There were also two Marines that looked like they were escorting the child of their captain. "You, toss her over the wall," commanded the blonde. A Marine in a cadet's uniform slowly approached with a frown, "But, sir, she's just a kid, she might get hurt." Kobe smiled at the soldier. He just knew they wouldn't hurt a little girl. "I don't care, I want her gone and my daddy is the captain of this base. That means you have to listen to me." He turned back toward Rika and her tear-stained face. "I don't care if she's some stupid kid, she broke the rules, now," he said, pointing at the still sobbing girl, "toss her." The Pinket's smile turned into shock when he saw the Marine begin to approach the little girl. Surely he wasn't going to follow that order, the blonde kid wasn't even his superior. The cadet walked up to Rika with an apologetic smile on his face, picking her up when she was close enough. The girl scrambled to get out of his arms but he held on tightly, leaning to whisper into her ear. The three people currently hanging off the wall watched the man say something to the little girl before he unceremoniously launched her over the stone barrier. Two heads followed her form through the air before they could even think to move. The third head wasn't going to be letting her get hurt. As soon as the Rika had left the man's arms, Luffy's hands let go of the top of the wall and his body dropped to the ground. When he felt the earth beneath his feet, he immediately jumped into the air to intercept the small brown-haired child before she could land. Kobe and Nami watched the screaming Rika hit Luffy's body, the two dropping safely to the ground, and both sighed in relief. Neither of them had wanted to see her get hurt. The straw-hatted teen landed easily and set the girl down as she opened her eyes, black orbs widening when they saw who'd saved her. "Luffy!" she screamed, immediately wrapping her arms around his middle. Luffy smiled and hugged back. "Miss me?" Rika furiously nodded her head into his stomach, smearing it with wet tears, but he didn't mind. "Rika, you need to get back home. Your mom is worried sick about you," reasoned Kobe's voice while he and Nami approached. They'd both been glad to see the young girl uninjured. Rika sniffled, pulling back from Luffy and turning in the Pinket's direction. "He's right, Rika. Why don't you hurry on back to the bar? I'll make sure Zoro is just fine. Don't you worry," the straw-hatted teen added. He could see that she was reluctant to listen to Kobe's words and gave his own to make sure she did. Rika's eyes shot back to Luffy and stayed there for a moment before she reluctantly nodded. Without a word, the small girl released her hold on the taller black-haired boy and stomped her way back to the bar. She wasn't all that happy about being thrown. It had been scary. Plus, that stupid blonde jerk smashed up the food she'd made for Zoro. The three watched Rika walk away until her form disappeared in the distance, turning back toward the wall. Nami faced Luffy to ask what he was going to do about Zoro but found the place he'd previously been empty. She heard a thump on the other side of the wall and she and Kobe looked at each other for a moment before rushing to climb the stone barrier once again. Zoro's eyes left the destroyed onigiri on the ground as he looked up, his eyes meeting someone he hadn't seen in a couple of weeks. "Luffy." The swordsman grumbled. He would have been more enthusiastic but what could he say, he was starving. "Mind grabbing that onigiri for me?" he asked seriously. Luffy looked at his friend incredulously, pointing to the destroyed food at his feet. "You want to eat that?" he asked. "Rika was kind enough to make it for me. It'd be a shame to let it go to waste," the Verde reasoned. The straw-hatted teen couldn't help but smile at the other boy's words. Zoro was a good guy. Luffy bent his knees and scooped up the ruined balls of rice covered in dirt, bringing them up to his friends. Zoro forced down every bit of the food that the little girl had made for him, getting it down as quickly as he possibly could. Dirt and sugar weren't the best seasonings for rice. The last bit of onigiri went down his throat and he gasped like he'd just run a marathon, before smiling in the direction of the bar. "Thanks, Luffy. I'll have to tell her I enjoyed every bite." The black-haired boy smiled back before his eyes curiously glanced at the ropes holding the swordsman against the pole he was tied to. "Why haven't you broken those yet?" he asked genuinely. He knew Zoro easily could if he wanted to, so why hadn't he? Because upstanding citizens are supposed to follow the rules, and currently, that's what I still am. Zoro smirked, looking at the smile plastering itself on Luffy's face. The straw-hatted teen's grin seemed to widen even further when he went to reply, "Well then, Zoro, I think it's time we changed And who the hell are you?" a snotty voice interrupted. Luffy turned to see the blonde kid from earlier standing there once again. Behind him stood a contingent of low-ranking Marines, all pointing rifles in their direction. The two didn't reply, only stared at the other boy. Neither of them could get past how stupid his hair was making him look. Helmeppo scowled at the intruders before turning to his men. "Kill them both instead of just the one on the pole." He'd been coming down to execute the swordsman that had killed his cute puppy and found another person there. Before the Marine captain's son could even register what had happened, bodies began to fly everywhere. His eyes looked around wildly as he watched the straw-hatted to kill send each of his men through the air with a single punch. Soon enough, he was the only one left. Luffy slowed and turned to the funny-looking blonde boy, going to address him, but was beaten to the punch. "Where the hell do you put my swords?" Zoro growled over the groans of the men on the ground. Helmeppo couldn't lie, the voice scared him, so much so, that his brain stopped working. The swordsman turned his head away from the silent idiot and toward his soon-to-be captain. "I'd appreciate it if you could grab my swords for me." His head nodded at Helmeppo. He took them, so he should know where they are. "We can continue this conversation when you get back." "You got it, Zoro," Luffy said, walking toward the blonde boy, looking at him with wide eyes. He wasted no time in picking him up and throwing him over his shoulder. He bent at the knees and laughed at Helmeppo starting to whine. "Hang on tight," advised the teen before launching into the air, the blonde over his shoulder screaming the whole way. A little to the left, a large man yelled. In response, the massive statue of his likeness was moved slightly in the direction he'd ordered. Captain Axehand Morgan examined the position of his sculpture with a critical eye. "Nope, back right. I don't like eye." His words were interrupted by feet slamming into the roof. They belonged to a boy in a straw hat and he seemed to be carrying his son. "What the hell is that ugly thing?" Luffy asked curiously, eyeing the large wooden statue. He didn't see Helmeppo pale at his words. "What the hell did you just say?" A deep voice came from over the straw-hatted teen's shoulder. He turned in its direction and was met with quite the figure. The ugly statue actually kind of looked like him. The tall man had buzzed blonde hair, the same color as Helmeppo's, and a literal iron jaw, the word "Mo" written on the chin. His marine captain's coat had no sleeves, showing off the man's large tan muscles, and a blue pair of pants with even darker blue tiger stripes. The most eye-catching thing about him, however, was his right arm. The appendage, from the middle down, was replaced with a piece of iron in the shape of an axe, and instead of an elbow, the end of the axe pushed his skin outward. The whole thing looked very abnormal. "Daddy, help me," Helmeppo screamed, thrashing around in Luffy's arms. Surely his father would save him. Axehand Morgan looked at the boy with contempt. "Shut up, you useless son," he growled. "Don't think I didn't see what you did earlier," the man said. Helmeppo was confused. His father had never talked to him like that before. And just what exactly was he talking about? What he'd done earlier, when he'd thrown the little girl out? Was he mad because she was just a little girl? "What do you mean, Daddy? She broke the law, so I was teaching her a lesson, just like you would," the blonde boy exclaimed. The tall man growled at his son. "Then, is there a reason she's still Ally?" "Son Pom," Luffy screamed, slamming his hand into the roof. He couldn't care less about the conversation between the two. He just wanted to find Zoro's swords and get out of there. He still had to go pick up everyone else, and then it was finally time to go to the Grand Line. Helmeppo screamed into the air as the two fell through the floor and didn't stop when the straw-hatted teen began to carry him through the halls of the marine base. "Which way?" Luffy asked. The blonde only shook his head in answer, so he punched him in the hopes that it would convince the other boy to talk. It did. Okay, fine," Helmeppo screamed, holding his head in pain. No one had ever hit him before. "They're in my room. It's down that hallway." He he answered, pointing in the direction of a split hallway. The pirate captain quickly ran in the direction pointed to and began opening every door he saw, none of them looking like a bedroom. Before he went to hit Helmeppo for lying to him, he pulled the last door open and was met with a sight he was not expecting at all. A pink room that looked like it belonged to a 7-year-old girl obsessed with princesses. Luffy began to turn away from the room, thinking that there was no way it was Helmeppo's, before he saw something that changed his mind. Zoro's sword sat directly against the window sill. "This your room?" he asked. He tried to hold in his hysterical laughter but wasn't able to. Helmeppo hung his head listening to the boy laugh as they walked through the door. He'd never actually thought anyone else would see it. Kobe watched Luffy's form fly toward the roof and couldn't just sit there any longer. Zoro had only been protecting Rika, he didn't deserve to starve for that. The pink kid went to jump the wall but was stopped by Nami grabbing his arm, his eyes turning in her direction. "Don't. He can get out of there himself, just trust me," the orange-haired girl reasoned. She'd watched him do things way more impossible than escaping from some rope. The aspiring marine softly pulled his arm out of her grasp. "I don't care. He's not doing anything and I can't just keep watching." He wasn't going to live his life on the sidelines anymore. He pulled himself the rest of the way over the wall, and just as he went to drop to the ground, the cracking of wood ripped through the air. Nami watched the falling form with a sigh. Boys just never listened. Maybe they were all idiots. She thought about leaving to head back to the dock for a moment. The thought of stealing the Mary even crossing her mind before she shook it away. Something about it just didn't feel right. She focused back in on the yard, ultimately deciding to stay and watch. It had absolutely nothing to do with Luffy or Zoro, absolutely nothing. Kobe looked up before he moved to untie Zoro and gaped at seeing a large sculpture on the top of the marine base beginning to tilt. Only a few seconds passed before it finally toppled over the edge and began hurtling toward the ground. As it impacted, the sound of ripping wood came from the statue, and its head was bent so far that it actually came off before the rest of the figure hit the ground with a boom. The pink-haired boy eyed the cloud of dust in shock for a moment before he looked up at a voice coming from where the statue had just fallen from. "My statue?" Kobe watched in shock as the man hurled himself off the roof and landed next to the imitation of his likeness, slightly cracking the ground underneath. There was a moment of silence as the man mourned his fallen beauty before it abruptly ended. "And what might we have here?" His deep, menacing voice came as he slowly stood to his feet. "You friends with the brat that did this?" The imposing figure turned around and Kobe wouldn't lie, even though he was a Marine. He was insanely frightening. It looked like he would kill anyone right now, not just criminals, and the thought was making the pink kid's knees shake something fierce. Maybe he should have just listened to Nami. Chapter 27, First Mate. "You friends with the brat that did this?" Morgan asked, standing and turning toward Kobe and Zoro. The Verde looked at the large blonde man and couldn't help but think he looked similar to the kid that had him arrested. He assumed it was probably the captain of the base, otherwise known as Helmeppo's daddy. What a strange way for a boy to refer to their father. Kobe's knees shook violently in the face of axe-hand Morgan now walking in his direction. A Marine had never scared him so much before. To be fair, he hadn't met many in the first place, but the sentiment was the same nonetheless. "Sorry, sir." The boy stammered, "I just don't think he should be executed." Zoro watched the interaction in boredom. He had no idea who the kid was and if the Marine captain had birthed the idiot that put him there. Let's just say, he was more worried about dying from starvation than being killed outright. He shook his head and looked up to the roof. Where the hell was Luffy with his swords? His wrists were chafed to the high heavens and he was more than ready to get out of his bindings. Morgan shot the small pink-haired child a menacing glare. "You disrespecting me, you pink-haired shrimp?" Kobe paled but couldn't help gaping incredulously at the same time. How was he disrespecting him? He'd said one sentence, sure. He disagreed with the decision to have Zoro killed. But Helmeppo made that decision. Not him. No sir. I just don't then. Like I give a shit about what you think, shrimp boy. The man interrupted. No one disrespected him and got away with it. If someone didn't respect him, they could die. If it was by his hand, all the better. He was the only person in the world that mattered. The Marine captain continued to stare. "You're disrespecting my authority and the consequence for that crime is death." Kobe stood still as Morgan began to approach. He couldn't move. He was too scared. Was he going to die? Was he going to die before he even got the chance to become an actual Marine? Was he going to be killed by the thing he admired most in the world? The thoughts kept him frozen in place. The man coming to kill him not slowing for even a moment. Better do something, kid. He's serious. Zoro provided, still hanging from the wooden poles. He knew the eyes of someone ready to kill, and the large blonde man fit the bill perfectly. The pink kid continued to stare wide-eyed even after Zoro's words. He was just too frightened. No matter what he said to himself, he couldn't make a move, and it was scaring him even more, creating a never-ending cycle that continued to hold him in place. The tied-up swordsman stared blankly at the still unmoving form. Just gonna stand there and die. He could see just how scared he was. It wasn't very difficult. The kid's legs were shaking so hard he thought he could feel some slight vibrations in the ground his feet stood on. Suddenly, the quiet air was broken by the sound of glass shattering. All conscious heads in the yard looking up to see 3 swords flying directly toward Zoro. One had a white sheath, its color reflecting the sun and making it the most eye-catching of the 3. The next blade was wrapped in red and looked as if it had been dyed in the blood of its enemies. The last katana was cloaked in dark black, standing in opposition to its white counterpart and seeming to suck in the light instead of reflecting it. The 3 katanas hit the ground, creating a triangle around the swordsman, the area remaining quiet for a moment as its 3 occupants watched the weapons bury themselves in the earth. "Hey, Zoro! I found your swords," Luffy shouted through the broken window of Helmeppo's room. Even with the distance, he could see the growing smirk on the swordsman's lips. He could jump down and help the 2, but, honestly, he just wanted to watch. He wanted to see his first mate become a pirate. So, that's exactly what he did, stepping up on the windowsill and sitting down on it. Helmeppo slowly backed away from his captor, quietly trying to sneak out of his room, but was apparently still too loud. A hand reached back and grabbed the blonde by the collar, wrenching him forward. "Nope, you're not going anywhere, girly boy." The straw-hatted pirate captain laughed, slamming Helmeppo into place beside him. Unfortunately, however, he ended up being a little enthusiastic about it. As soon as the Helmeppo's rear end touched wood, Luffy let his hand go. However, he hadn't accounted for the cushiness of his buttocks and he hit the windowsill, bouncing into the air before his very eyes. He watched in amusement as the blonde stilled for a moment, his eyes as wide as saucers. Helmeppo looked down and immediately started screaming when he saw the ground far below him. He began to fall and realized that his father was almost directly in the place he was going to land. Surely his daddy would save him. Even though he now knew he'd be safe, he still couldn't stop his screams. "Daddy, please save me. That devil hit me and then threw me out of the window," he cried, somehow managing to point in Luffy's direction as he continued to fall. "Kill him for hitting me and kidnapping me. Please, Daddy," he made foo. Axe Hand Morgan stepped out of the way of his son's falling form and let the boy slam into the ground, face first, his body making a crunch. Honestly, none of the people in the yard, and even Nami watching from the wall, were sure he was still alive. Helmeppo groaned in pain before he began to cry. "Daddy! Why didn't you catch me? I'm your son." He began to roll on the ground in absolute agony before he was roughly picked up, gasping when he felt his windpipe tighten and his body being lifted into the air. "You're not allowed to call me that anymore." Axe Hand Morgan spat in the face of his son. "You chose to disrespect me when you let that little girl live. And anyone who disrespects me, dies." He stared at the wide eyes of the boy he no longer considered family and continued to hold him there while he brought the axe, replacing his right hand to his neck. "I sentence you to death, the same as these 2. His eyes glanced up at the others who'd be following in Helmeppo's footsteps and they widened slightly, his hand pausing in the act of taking his son's life. The green-haired boy was gone, and so were his swords. "Listen to me, Luffy," Zoro stated, a click echoing in the air as Kitetsu slid back into its sheath. He looked up at the boy sitting on the windowsill from his position now in the middle of the yard. "We met almost a year ago," he said, his eyes never leaving his soon-to-be captain's. "Do you remember what I said back then, when I agreed to sail with you?" Luffy didn't reply, his smile growing larger as he listened to the words being spoken. "I told you that if you ever got in the way of my dream, I'd kill you myself." The swordsman's smile grew just as large as Luffy's when he saw the boy land in front of him, dust swirling all around his form. "If you're still alright with that, I have no problem becoming the worst criminal in history, if you asked it of me. If it means achieving my dream, I'll do anything. I'm gonna become the greatest swordsman this world has ever seen even if it kills me." Axe Hand Morgan watched the two interact with a scowl on his face. How had the green-haired one escaped from his bindings? He hadn't even heard anything. He went to yell at the two to shut their soon-to-be-dead mouths, but couldn't find his voice no matter how hard he tried. His grip on his son's neck began to loosen and the man wasn't exactly sure why. He wasn't doing it on purpose. "I've said it once, and I'll say it again." Luffy shot a manic grin in the direction of his first mate. The Pirate King would have no less on his crew. His grin widened even further as Helmeppo fell to the ground and scrambled away from his father. "How about we go turn this world upside down together?" Axe Hand Morgan, of the 153rd Marine Branch, attempted to take a step as enemies and found that his vision had somehow turned upside down. His eyes being met with an impossibility. Was that his own body? Zoro's grin turned devilish as a head rolled to his feet. The body it belonged to crashing into the earth while Helmeppo screamed bloody murder in the background. "You got it, Captain." "D-Daddy?" The blonde stuttered, eyeing his father's headless form, blood gushing from the open wound that was his neck. He didn't know what to think. Technically, the green-haired swordsman he'd sentenced to death had saved him. At the same time, however, he'd also just killed the only family he knew. Apparently, his mind couldn't decide whether to be grateful or upset because his body went limp and he passed out on the spot. Footsteps came rumbling into the yard from the entrance of the base and suddenly everyone in the area was surrounded by men in white uniforms. Whispers began to break out amongst the soldiers while they looked at all the bodies scattered around the yard, their eyes ultimately ending up on their deceased superior. They honestly had no idea whether to arrest the three or praise them for saving them from the tyranny of Axe Hand Morgan. The whispers eventually stopped, however, the men continued to stare at the sight of their captain's headless body staining the dirt crimson with wide eyes, none of them knowing what to do. After a time of silence, a brave Marine, now the current commanding officer, stepped forward and addressed the figures staring back at them. The man went to speak but didn't know exactly who he should be talking to. The boy with the straw hat looked to be the one in charge, but he was sure the one carrying the three swords had killed their captain. He didn't know what to think about the pink-haired one. The kid just looked like he'd rather be anywhere but there at the moment. He eventually decided to address the boy in the straw hat, but he still honestly had no idea what to say. Luffy looked at the Marine who'd stepped forward, curiously. It looked like he wanted to say something but couldn't figure out if it was the right thing to say. He waited for another moment before turning to Zoro. "Think we should get out of here?" he whispered, turning further to look over at the wall. He smiled when he saw a head of orange hair and a pair of brown eyes peeking over it. "Yeah, I guess so," replied the swordsman, still looking at the man who'd stepped forward and waiting for him to say something. Was he just going to keep blankly staring at them? He didn't really want to have to kill them all, but if they weren't gonna let them go quietly. The Marine watched the two converse as if they didn't care that they were surrounded, and it only made him more wary of his decision. However, he'd been standing there long enough. He didn't know if it was the right decision, but it was the one his heart wanted him to make. "The three of you are pirates, yes?" the man finally asked. It was the only assumption he could make. They didn't look like straight-up murderers and piracy was popular amongst the younger generations. He thought it was the most likely assumption. "I'm not a pirate. I want to be a Marine," Kobe squeaked from his position behind Zoro and Luffy. The boy bowed to the man he'd spoken to. "Please let me join you here at this base." All heads turned in his direction and made him want to shrink into a tiny ball. He hadn't meant to bring so much attention to himself, but he wasn't just going to sit by and let others determine the course of his life anymore. This was his life to live, not anyone else's, and he was going to live it chasing his dream. The Marine stared at the boy for a moment. "But you obviously know these two. You're not with them?" He wasn't convinced. All three of them looked pretty friendly with each other. Zoro shrugged to the man. "I've never met this kid before." He turned and eyed his captain. He assumed he was a friend of Luffy's considering the two showed up together. "Oh, I know him all right," Luffy said with a grin. "You'll never guess where I met him." Kobe's eyes widened at the words. Surely he wasn't going to tell them. "There was this huge ugly pink pirate ship," Luffy started, using his hands to better tell the story. "Luffy," the aspiring Marine tried to interrupt, panicking internally. Why was he telling them this? The pirate captain ignored his friend's pleading and continued. "And you'll never guess what he told me. He said he'd been stew." He stopped before he could finish, Kobe's fist slamming into the side of his face and staggering him slightly. He recovered quickly and grinned, rubbing his cheek. "That all you got, coward?" His smile only seemed to provoke the Pinkett further. "How could you?" Kobe screamed, sending his fist in Luffy's direction again. He'd said they were friends. How could he try and ruin his dream like that? If they knew he was on Alvida's ship for over 2 years, he probably wouldn't be able to join the Marines at any base, let alone this one. Luffy easily dodged the punch and sent his own in Kobe's direction, the smile never leaving his face. As the appendage connected with his face, the smaller teen's body went flying toward the circle of soldiers, and he groaned when his body hit the ground, rolling to the feet of the man who'd addressed them. The acting Marine captain bent down and winced at the fist imprint on the kid's cheek. "All right, it was safe to assume they weren't friends. Stand up, kid. I get the picture. You're not with these two." He helped Kobe stand to his feet and didn't quite understand when he shot a wide-eyed look at the boy who'd punched him. "And as for your request about joining this branch, well, I guess I'm technically in charge now, so I hope you're ready, kid. I'm gonna work you to the bone." Kobe's eyes seemed to widen even further at the man's words. It was only now hitting him. Luffy said that to provoke him. He said that get him riled up enough to throw that punch and make it seem like they weren't friends. Even now Luffy was pushing him toward his dream, and it made the corners of his eyes water. He'd been blessed to meet such an amazing person, such an amazing friend. Luffy made to approach Kobe once again, his fist barred, but Zoro held him in place, the swordsman sending his captain a knowing smile. He didn't really understand what was going on, but he could tell Luffy was acting. It wasn't that hard, he wasn't very good at it. All right, I get it," the man shouted, now standing in front of Kobe in a protective manner. "Time to get this over with. As for you two." He pointed in Luffy and Zoro's direction before looking at the men surrounding them apologetically. "I don't know how these men feel, but personally, I want to thank you." The Marine proceeded to bow at the waist in a gesture of thanks. The man you killed wasn't a good person or a good commanding officer. He was about as selfish and corrupt as it gets. I don't necessarily condone his death, but, at the same time, I can't help but be glad he's gone. He stood back straight and looked both the boys in the eye. "Because of you two, I can do what I joined the force to do, protect and serve. And for that, you have my gratitude." The man faced the rest of the Marines surrounding the two boys and addressed them. "I'm sorry, men. I understand if you can't look up to me as a commanding officer because of my words." His eyes widened when he saw all of the Marines in the circle bowing to the two pirates they had trapped. "Thank you very much," the men yelled in unison. The acting captain smiled at the group before turning back to Luffy and Zoro. "As thankful as I—" He cut himself off, looking at his men beginning to stand from their bows with a smile. "As thankful as we are for being freed from the tyranny of our late captain. The two of you are still pirates, and I must ask you to leave this island, otherwise I will be forced to arrest you." Luffy looked at Zoro with a smile, the Verde shrugging in response. "Our Marines, you guys are all right," exclaimed the pirate captain, turning back toward the wall. "Let's go say bye to Rika before we leave, Zoro." "I'm afraid I can't let Yo." The man stopped when he saw the glare the green-haired swordsman was shooting him. "You know what?" He paused when he realized he was shaking. Maybe it was best to just let the two do as they pleased. "Just don't stay too long, please," he eventually finished, wiping the sweat from his brow. Satisfied, Zoro released the man from his gaze and turned, following his captain to the gate. He still needed to thank Rika for the food. Kobe watched the two leave in silence. He wanted to thank Luffy more than anything at the moment, but held himself back. He was grateful for the boy that had helped him start pursuing his dream. He hoped he got to see him again someday. The Pinkett shook his head, smiling, and turned away from the retreating figures. He'd surely be seeing his friend in the newspaper sometime soon. "All right, men. First things first. We chose to let pirates go after they killed our commanding officer, as pence. No food for the next 3 weeks. I assume there will be no complaints?" the acting Marine captain said, eyes searching his surrounding men. Kobe rose his hand to his head in a salute, just as the other Marines around him did, and they all replied with the same words, "Sir, no sir." "Good." The man pointed at the body of the person he'd replaced. Now, even though he may have been a terrible man, He was still our commanding officer. We will give him the proper send-off he deserves for having held that title. Gather the body and prepare it for burial." The pink-haired boy spared one last glance at Zoro and Luffy's forms slowly growing smaller, his smile becoming more determined as he turned back to his new captain and saluted once more. "Sir, yes sir. I ate every bite, Rika." Zoro smiled, it was delicious. The smaller girl's eyes brightened at the words and she rushed the green-haired boy, wrapping her arms around his middle. "I'm happy you liked them, Zoro," she exclaimed. Rika pulled back and frowned up at one of the boys she considered a big brother. "I tried to bring you food earlier, but Mama wouldn't let me." The swordsman laughed at the words, ruffling the girl's hair. Much to her chagrin, she was just trying to keep you safe, Rika. Ririka watched the two with an affectionate smile. She was very glad that her little girl was okay and she had Luffy to thank for that apparently. Her daughter had come storming into the bar and when she'd asked what happened, Rika gave the full rundown. She'd had some choice words for the blonde boy who'd ordered her to be thrown over the wall. When the story was finished, the older woman realized that she was mostly just upset about her food being ruined. She'd raised quite the spitfire and she hadn't even known it. "Just keep sailing with us," Nami begged Luffy from his place next to the girl at the bar. "Being all alone is no fun." Nami's stomach dropped at the word alone, and she turned away from him. His words were making her unbelievably anxious. The reason being how compelling they were. After spending time on the Mary for the first time in what felt like forever, it was hard to leave again. "Luffy, she couldn't finish, she just didn't know how to respond." "Why can't you?" the straw-hatted teen asked, seriously. He knew the girl was reluctant for some reason, but he could also see just how much she wanted to say yes. What was keeping her from doing that? Also, he yawned, "I like making new friends, and I like to think that's a pretty good reason." "Well, I think that's stupid," the unnamed girl said, a frown in her voice. "Well, why do you think it's stupid?" Luffy asked, curiously. He was too tired to get mad that she had, in a way, called him stupid. "Because I can't trust you. Being friends is all about trust," she began. "You say you like making friends, but that doesn't make me trust you." Luffy's mind was getting foggier by the second. "So, until you can trust me, we can't be friends?" he asked. The girl could do whatever she wanted. She wasn't gonna hurt him. He just had a feeling. He didn't have anything to say about all this trust business right now. He'd figure it out when he woke up. That's exactly right. Was that it? Was it because she still didn't trust him? The thought made Luffy's heart ache slightly. Even after everything they'd been through, she still didn't trust him enough to tell him what was bothering her. The bad feelings were quickly wiped from the boy's mind. He was never one to mope about things. He'd already decided that Nami would be his navigator and she would be. He didn't care what he had to do. Because the words just wouldn't come out of her mouth. The orangeette continued to stare at the wooden bar while she fiddled with her hands. She'd thought about telling him, even before now. She just knew that if there was one person that could save her from Arlong, it was Luffy. Nami laughed internally, remembering the dreams she'd had about hiring Mary's terrible trio to hunt the fishman down. Seemed like her subconscious thought along the same lines. But the part of her that was still hurt over losing her mother to the monster. The part that couldn't bear to see someone else close to her heart taken. It wouldn't let the words come out. She couldn't take seeing her friend die. It would break her, and if it was because of her, because she asked him to save her, she didn't know if she could live with herself after something like that. Luffy stared at the orangeette while she continued to avoid his gaze. "Nami." He reached over and grasped her hand softly, her brown eyes finally coming back up to meet his black ones. "I don't know why you feel like you can't trust me. If it's because I'm a pirate now, well, I'm not gonna say sorry for that, but if it's for some other reason," he bowed his head in her direction, "if I did something wrong, I'm truly sorry and I hope you'll allow me some way to fix it." Nami's eyes widened and she shook her free hand in front of herself. "Luffy, stop, you didn't do anything wrong." Seeing the boy who had only ever helped her bow his head made her stomach curl. It made her realize how her reluctance might be making him feel. "Luffy, my decision has nothing to do with you, or even the fact that you're a pirate." She placated, seeing him raise his head. Luffy looked at her curiously but saw that she had more to say so didn't interrupt. The orange-haired girl went to continue but suddenly lost the will. She didn't have it in her to argue with him anymore. Besides, she didn't even know if she could get a boat and shells. And waiting for one to be built didn't appeal to her. Maybe traveling with him as Zoro for a little while longer wouldn't be so bad. They may even be able to help her steal from Buggy the Clown. Fine. She sighed. She saw Luffy perk up at the words and sent him a sad smile. But, I can't stay, Luffy. The boy's rising smile faltered at the words, but he immediately wiped the feeling away and let it finish forming. You let me worry about that. Nami was shocked to stillness by the words, silently watching Luffy stand from his seat to pick up Rika and mercilessly tickle her sides. He knew absolutely nothing about her situation, and yet he somehow managed to make it sound like he would fix it. It baffled her. She wanted nothing more than to ask him then and there to save her once again, but she didn't. She held her tongue and watched the little girl in his arms laugh like she didn't have a care in the world. A part of her wished it could be her. "All right, Captain. Probably about time we head out," Zoro said, finishing his conversation with Ririka. He walked over to the straw-hatted boy as he set Rika on the ground and clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Usopp's probably waiting on us." His lips rose into a teasing grin at the thought of their long-nosed friend had enough time to say goodbye. Luffy laughed at the words, agreed. He patted Rika on the head and turned to Nami when she began to rise out of her seat, sending her a smile. "You and Zoro head down to the docks. I'll be right behind you guys." The words confused the orange-haired girl, but she didn't voice her curiosity. If she wasn't going to share her business with him, what right did she have to ask about his? She nodded and stepped in the swordsman's direction, turning to face Ririka when her feet found themselves next to his. "It was nice to meet you, Ririka." She looked down at the little girl now standing next to her mother. "You stay out of trouble, Rika." Ririka looked at Nami with kind eyes while her daughter smiled and nodded in confirmation. "It was also a pleasure to meet you, Nami." She turned her head in Zoro's direction. "It was nice to see you and Luffy again, Zoro. Don't stay away for too long now. I'm sure my little one will miss the two of you terribly." The Verde staggered when he felt Rika run into his form but quickly recovered and patted her head in a show of affection. "We'll be back someday, Rika. I think it'll be a little longer this time, but we'll see each other again." He smiled, getting down to his knees so he could look the girl in the eye. "And again, I can't thank you enough for the food. I know someone who would have been very proud of what you did. Even if you would have only been thinking of how she might look when she got older." One last thing crossed Zoro's mind and he smiled at her teasingly. "I know that dumb blondie was mean. But I really do think you should try salt next time." He laughed at the pout Rika sent him. "Don't worry, though. Even with the sugar, I'd be glad to try your onigiri again anytime." The girl smiled again and wrapped her arms around his neck one more time before walking back to stand with her mother. He stood and turned away from them, waving over his shoulder with a smile as he walked through the doors, Nami following closely behind. The mother and daughter watched the swinging wood for a moment before their attention was grabbed by Luffy clearing his throat, both turning to face him before he spoke. "You wouldn't happen to have a den mushi, would you?" the straw-hatted boy asked, hopefully. Ririka smiled and pointed to the stairs up to her and Rika's rooms. "It's on the wall, between the doors." Luffy grinned in return and dashed up the stairs. "Thanks," he called over his shoulder. His feet found the top step and he searched the hallway, finding what he was looking for exactly where the woman said it would be. He removed his hat while he approached and took out a tiny piece of paper tied to the inside of the straw, smiling in slight exasperation at the memory of receiving it. "Gimme my hat back, Gramps," Luffy yelled. He was doing something to it and he couldn't see exactly what. He would have taken it back already, but he didn't want another fist of love. He couldn't even use haky to soften the blows because Shanks told him to hide it from the man. The thought made the teen laugh internally. His red-haired teacher had been quite shocked to find out what family he was a part of. Although, he didn't really know why. Sure, Gramps was a big Marine, but he didn't think he had any other famous family than him. At least none that he knew of. Garp finished what he was doing and turned to hand the hat back. "Now, if you ever need me, find a den mushi and call that number, I'll answer, probably." Luffy looked at his grandfather with a pout, reclaiming his treasure. He hadn't even wanted the geezer to mess with it in the first place. He looked inside the straw hat and saw a white strip of paper tied into it. "Don't worry about getting it wet and smearing the numbers, I had it laminated." The aged Marine manically grinned. "I've been planning this since Ace left. I told myself that I wouldn't let another one of my precious grandsons leave without a way to contact their loving elder." The teen groaned at his overbearing grandfather, Gramps. Can it, Luffy, unless you want another fist of love. Luffy had almost forgotten the number was there because it was so small, but all the marine talk with Kobe had given him an idea and he'd remembered. If he wasn't going to be the marine Gramps wanted him to be, then why not his pink-haired friend? Although, now that he was thinking about it, with the way Kobe was now, if he ever got hit with a fist of love, he just might die. The teen shook his head and dialed the number into the Den Den Mushi, its ringing sound echoing through the small hallway. Puru 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 puru. Puru 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 poo. Gacha. Hello? A deep gruff voice eventually came from the other end of the call. Gramps? Luffy asked. It was strange hearing the man's voice after so long. Luffy? Is that you? The man questioned in return, his tone tinted with anger. There was a moment of silence before the teen responded as he braced himself for the screaming he knew was coming. Yep. He eventually replied, popping the page. You damn brat. Where the hell have you been? Every time I come back to Dawn. Now, you're nowhere to be found. Garp raged through the line. Luffy held the snail away from him so his eardrums didn't burst. He'd forgotten how loud Gramps could be. Come to Shellstown. There's a kid here that I want you to meet. I think you'll like him. He said, ignoring his grandfather's anger, or rather, being so used to it that he barely even heard it. There was a pause for a moment before the older man responded, Shellstown, huh? So that's where you are. Stay right there and don't move a damn muse. See ya, Gramps. It was nice talking to you. And his name's Kobe. The teen interrupted, cutting the call as quickly as he could. Talking to Gramps was always a hassle. He shook the thought away with a smile and retied the number into his treasure. Satisfied with his work, Luffy placed the hat on his head and made his way back down the stairs, passing Ririka and Rika on his way to the doors. He scooped the girl up before she could protest and gave her a tight hug. I'll miss you, Rika, he said, softly setting her back down and sending her mother a smile. Good to see you. Ririka smiled at the words and waved the boy away. You as well. Now, go after your friends. And again, I can't thank you enough for saving my daughter. The straw-hatted pirate captain smiled in return. No problem. He turned toward the doors and walked through them toward the dock to set sail once again, waving over his shoulder. Bye guys. Look for me in the news. He sprinted away before a reply came and, as he let his feet carry him, he couldn't help the giddy laughs that left his mouth. The main goal of coming to Shellstown had been achieved. The Straw Hat Pirates were now 2 strong instead of 1. And there were surely many more to come. Organ Island? Zoro asked curiously, as the 2 companions stepped onto the deck of the Mary. What's there? What was the girl going to get them into this time? Buggy the Clown. The Orange had answered. She assumed he may have heard the name while he'd been bounty hunting. The thought made her freeze while she looked at her compass. If he knew of Buggy, he probably knew of him too. The name's familiar. He's a pirate, right? The swordsman asked. The girl shook her thoughts away and got back on topic. Yeah. And he's got a map to the Grand Line. She said, well, he supposedly does. The words got Zoro's attention. Why would you need a map to sail into the Grand Line? The question must have been obvious on his face because Nami answered without him voicing it. It's a map to a place called Reverse Mountain. It's the only safe way into the Grand Line, apparently, she said, walking to her bag to grab one of the maps out of it. The Verde shrugged his shoulders at the words. At the end of the day, it was the captain's choice where they went. So, he would leave it up to Luffy. Let's just say, Zoro could already tell where they would most likely be heading next.